United States.
Donald Trump's first 100 days. Promises, promises. Not many pledges kept, but his supporters don't mind.
At a rally in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania last October, Donald Trump presented his 100-day action plan, a long list of goals to reform government. Achieving these was always a tall order, and the president has certainly kept busy. He is expected to sign 30 executive orders by the end of his first 100 days in office, more than any other president since Harry Truman. True to his word, he has withdrawn America from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a trade pact, appointed a conservative Supreme Court justice, and authorized the building of the Keystone oil pipeline. The president even seems intent on building his border wall with Mexico, although the financing is still hazy. Mexico, he now claims, will pay for the barrier at a later date in some form. But plenty of promises remain unfulfilled. Mr. Trump has declined to label China a currency manipulator. His attempt to ban travellers from several Muslim-majority countries has twice been thwarted by the courts. His plan to repeal and replace Obamacare never made it to a vote in Congress, though another attempt may be imminent. According to the Partnership for Public Service, a non-profit, Mr. Trump has nominated just 58 key executive branch officials who require Senate approval. In the first 100 days of his presidency, Barack Obama nominated 190. The State Department is understaffed. The Council of Economic Advisers sits empty. Presidents tend to start their tenures with high approval ratings that tail off over time. Mr. Trump's are already in the dumps, the worst start of any post-war president. But a closer examination of the polls reveals another story. America is now bitterly divided across party lines. Mr. Trump's approval among Republicans sits at a Reagan-esque 85%. As long as he can maintain the support of his base, and assuming the economy accelerates as expected, the opinions of his many detractors may not matter.
United States.
In pursuit of WikiLeaks. All change. Donald Trump adored WikiLeaks when it served his cause. Now, not so much.
The hypocrisy is breathtaking, but it looks as if the Trump administration really is going after WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, the self-styled transparency campaigner who runs it from the Ecuadorian embassy in London, where he's been holed up for 5 years, evading extradition to Sweden to face a rape allegation. As a candidate, Donald Trump said he loved WikiLeaks for helping his campaign by publishing embarrassing emails from the Democratic National Committee, hacked by the Russians. Now he's in the White House, he views leaks less indulgently. On April 20th, the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, declared that the arrest of Mr. Assange had become a priority. He added, "We are going to step up our efforts and are already stepping up our efforts on all leaks." The Department of Justice is said to be preparing charges against Mr. Assange. In a speech made a few days before Mr. Sessions' announcement, the director of the CIA, Mike Pompeo, excoriated WikiLeaks as a non-state hostile intelligence service often abetted by state actors like Russia. Mr. Pompeo's wrath had been incurred after the release by Mr. Assange's outfit of information about some of the CIA's surveillance tools. Mr. Pompeo, like his boss, had previously been a WikiLeaks fan, regularly tweeting its revelations last summer to attack Hillary Clinton. Even if Mr. Pompeo's designation of WikiLeaks is accurate, and Susan Hennessy, managing editor of the Lawfare blog, thinks it may be, it may not provide a path to prosecution. But, as Hennessy says, an indictment might be possible under the Espionage Act or laws governing theft of government property and computer abuse. Chelsea Manning, the army intelligence analyst jailed for providing WikiLeaks with a huge dump of classified material in 2010, was indicted under all three laws, though her sentence was commuted by Barack Obama before he left office. It appears that Mr. Assange may have both incited Mr. Manning, as he then was, to commit his crimes and helped to facilitate them. If so, says Ms. Hennessy, it might be fairly easy in purely legal terms to bring a conspiracy charge against Mr. Assange. This raises the question of why the Obama administration, not known for its tolerance of leaks, decided to stay its hand when it came to Mr. Assange. The reason was the difficulty of distinguishing WikiLeaks activities from investigative journalism, which is protected by the bit of the First Amendment covering freedom of the press. Mr. Obama was far from convinced that WikiLeaks and Mr. Assange did merit such protection, but was troubled about where a prosecution might go politically. Mr. Trump's intense hostility towards the mainstream media for what he perceives as its bias against him means that he is unlikely to feel any such compunction. The overlap between what WikiLeaks and traditional media organizations do has also become increasingly blurred. News outlets such as the New York Times and the Washington Post have introduced Secure Drop, which describes itself as an open-source whistleblower submission system that media organizations can use to securely accept documents from and communicate with anonymous sources. Given that both newspapers published the best bits of the material WikiLeaks ran from the DNC hack, it must be assumed that if Russian intelligence agents had opted to provide it to them via Secure Drop, they would happily have used it. They know that if they do not publish such material, there are plenty of rivals who will. Ms. Hennessy argues that there is still a vital difference between WikiLeaks and, say, the New York Times. The Times edits and checks. Its motives are different. It is not linked to hostile intelligence agencies. Such distinctions may not trouble Mr. Sessions, but, as Mr. Trump has found, the courts do not always do his bidding.
United States.
Minimum wages. Leaving a bad taste. Higher minimum wages may force bad restaurants out of business.
With Republicans in charge in Washington, the federal minimum wage is unlikely to alter soon. But debate over the impact of local pay floors is as hot as ever. Little wonder 18 states and 22 cities and counties raised their minimum wages at the start of 2017, according to the National Employment Law Project, a campaign group. Left-wing activists have for years pushed politicians to guarantee minimum pay of $15 an hour, more than twice the federal minimum of $7.25, which last went up in 2009. A new working paper by Dara Lee Luca of Mathematica Policy Research and Michael Luca of Harvard Business School looks at the impact of higher minimum wages from a new angle. Traditionally, scholars have focused on whether or not minimum wages reduce employment. But the Lucas asked something else. Does it force firms out of business? In particular, they looked at the restaurant industry. About half of minimum wage workers toil over food in the San Francisco Bay Area, which contains 15 of the 41 cities and counties that have changed their minimum wages since 2012. Their analysis relies on data from Yelp, a restaurant review app favoured by millennials. The Lucas found that a restaurant has, on average, a 1 in 250 chance of closing in any given month. Whether or not the odds change when the minimum wage rises seems to depend on the quality of the eatery, or at least on its Yelp rating. Restaurants with a coveted 5-star score are barely affected, but less impressive joints are suddenly more likely to close. Restaurants with a middling rating are about 14% more likely to shut down when the minimum wage goes up by $1. The authors also show that rating is distinct from price. In other words, a glorious but cheap takeaway has less to worry about than sellers of pricey but tasteless fare. The result can be spun multiple ways. If those scholars who say that overall restaurant employment is unaffected by higher minimum wages are right, the implication of the new paper is that pay floors somehow force up the quality of restaurants. So long as one minimum wage worker is much like another, a laid-off waiter will be able to find a new job somewhere serving better grub. If those scholars are wrong, however, then the new paper supports what skeptics have said all along, that higher minimum wages, by threatening the viability of some firms, dent employment opportunities for the low-skilled. That should be food for thought.
United States.
Pine Ridge's alcohol epidemic. The wounds of Whiteclay. Will revoking liquor licenses make a difference?
The Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota, the site of the Battle of Wounded Knee, contains one of the poorest counties in America, and every one of its residents is affected in some way by alcoholism. So says Robert Braveheart, Sr., one of the leaders of Red Cloud, a private Catholic school founded in 1888 by Jesuits, at the request of Red Cloud, a chief of the Oglala Lakota, the tribe of Crazy Horse. Most of his people, says Mr. Braveheart, cannot drink alcohol in moderation. He thinks he is one of them. After bad experiences with booze as a teenager, he has not touched alcohol for 40 years. Alcohol has been banned in Pine Ridge since 1889, except for a few months in the 1970s. Yet 2/3 of adults on the reservation are alcoholics. Alcohol-fueled domestic violence is rampant, and 1 in 4 babies born on the reservation is irreversibly damaged by fetal alcohol syndrome, a range of neurological defects caused by mothers drinking alcohol during pregnancy. One of the main sources of alcohol for the reservation's residents is Whiteclay, a tiny hamlet of 11 residents just a short walk away across the state line in Nebraska. Whiteclay, which has no school and no grocery shop, seems to exist solely to sell booze. On April 19th, Nebraska's State Liquor Board voted to revoke the licenses of Whiteclay's 4 liquor stores, which are due to expire on April 30th. They argued that the town is not well enough policed, reason enough to revoke a license. A lawyer for the shops said at once that his clients would appeal. Activists such as Frank Lemire, a member of the Winnebago tribe who has fought for 22 years to shut down the shops, are jubilant about the state board's decision. They argue that the shops have been making immoral profits from the misery of vulnerable residents of the reservation. Last year, the shop sold an astonishing 3.6 million cans of beer, or 7 cans per minute, almost all to the Lakota Sioux. Yet Mr. Braveheart and others are skeptical about the license revocation. They say those who want to drink will simply drive to get their booze farther afield, which will increase both the already high number of fatal drunk driving car crashes and bootlegging. Alcoholism is a social and spiritual problem, says Mr. Braveheart. It cannot be reversed with the stroke of a pen. Patty Pansing Brooks, a Democratic state senator from Nebraska, is the author of the bill creating the Whiteclay Public Health Emergency Task Force, which unanimously passed the unicameral State House on April 24th. She agrees that it will take more than prohibition to help the alcoholics in Pine Ridge. Ms. Pansing Brooks wants a substation of the Nebraska State Patrol set up in Whiteclay, as well as demolition of abandoned buildings where crime and trafficking are rife. She also wants to create a detox center with a job training program and promote economic development by giving residents access to wireless broadband. She says she feels a duty to do something because of her state's complicity in destroying the tribe. Her efforts are backed by Tom Brewer, Nebraska's first Native American state senator, who grew up on the Pine Ridge Reservation. As a staunch Republican, he is at the other end of the political spectrum, but the two senators are united in their outrage at what is happening in Pine Ridge. More than half perhaps 80% of its adults are unemployed. About half live below the federal poverty line. Almost 1/3 are homeless. Men die on average at 47 and women at 55. Almost half the population older than 40 is diabetic. The infant mortality rate is triple the national average, the suicide rate of teenagers is more than double, and obesity is an even bigger problem than in the rest of the Midwest. Students of journalism at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln recently produced a wide-ranging report on the impact of the liquor shops on the reservation. It was called The Wounds of White Clay, Nebraska's Shameful Legacy. Those wounds will take a long time to heal, if they ever do.
United States.
Art and history. Rhett Butler's resting place. An old controversial painting and a new way to remember the Civil War.
Before there were IMAX cinemas, there were panoramas. Typically around 400 feet long and 50 feet high, the immersive paintings toured America in the last decades of the 19th century, sometimes accompanied by 3D dioramas. They weren't meant to last, and when ticket sales dwindled, most were discarded like old fairground rides. Only 2 made in their heyday can still be seen in the country. One is at and of Gettysburg. The other, known as the Atlanta Cyclorama, encapsulates the problems involved in commemorating the Civil War and a possible solution. The cyclorama was made by a team of German artists in Milwaukee in the mid-1880s. Photographs of their workshop reveal a lubricating beer supply and a patriotic pin-up of Kaiser Wilhelm I. The subject was the Battle of Atlanta, a crucial Union victory, specifically the afternoon of July 22nd, 1864. Many Midwestern soldiers fought there. The picture was intended profitably to celebrate Northern heroism. When the cyclorama made its way south, first to Chattanooga and then, in 1892, to Atlanta itself, its meaning was reversed. An impresario recoloured the uniforms of captured Confederates to make them look like routed Yankees. In line with the region's mythology, which even today can make it seem that the South won every battle but lost on a technicality, advertisements declared it the only Confederate victory ever painted. In time, the behemoth was donated to the city, and from 1921 it was housed in a purpose-built hall next to the zoo. After Clark Gable visited in 1939 for the premiere of Gone with the Wind, a Rhett Butler figurine was added to the diorama, reputedly at his suggestion. Understandably, the facility's upkeep was not a financial priority for some black politicians who from the 1970s ran the city administration. Unease about where and how to remember the war and its aftermath has only intensified. On April 24th, marked in some states as Confederate Memorial Day, a monument to a post-war insurrection by white supremacists was taken down in New Orleans. The workers wore face masks and flak jackets because of the risk of reprisals. Sheffield Hale, a proud, thoughtful white Southerner who runs the Atlanta History Center, advocates a middle way between rejection and misinformed embrace of Civil War memorabilia. His museum has leased the cyclorama from the city, recently winching its rolled-up 6-ton bulk through a hole in the roof of its old home and installing it in a bespoke rotunda. It will be displayed there, Mr. Hale says, as an artefact rather than a moonlight and magnolias attraction. The exhibition will present it not as a shrine, but as a palimpsest, as full of meaning as it is of bloodshed, with explanations not only of the battle, but of the painting's own past, including the long stretch in which white and black viewing hours were segregated. At present, the cyclorama is partly obscured by scaffolding. 2 lost chunks will be replaced, along with a missing slice of sky. The original hyperbolic shape will be restored, as will Rhett Butler. When the work is finished next year, a therapeutic approach to studying history will be set in train, and a near-extinct art form will be revived. So might a once popular Atlanta pastime, purporting to recognise people amid the thousands of fighting, writhing, dying figures captured in oils. Only one, a Union steward, is black. Not long ago, Mr. Hale discovered that an ancestor, Arthur Hale, fought in the battle with an Alabama infantry unit, as did his brother Farish. Standing in front of the canvas, Mr. Hale points to a skirmish taking place in what is now a smart part of town. Farish was killed in it. Great-great-granddaddy Arthur later married his brother's widow, making that day my reason for being here. It's very personal, adds Mr. Hale, as Southern history tends to be.
United States.
Transport in Los Angeles. City of cars. The money for public transport is there, but plenty of barriers remain.
When the Los Angeles Transit Authority extended a railway to link the city's towering downtown to Santa Monica, a swanky seaside neighborhood, last May, Angelinos rushed to experience it as if to glimpse a celebrity. For 6 decades there had been no rail connection from the center to the West Side beaches. So exciting was the concept that queues formed at 9:30 a.m. to catch the first train at noon. A year later, Los Angeles is gearing up to build a rail link to the traffic-strangled International Airport, introduce new rapid transit bus routes, and extend subway lines, among other things. The ventures will be financed by money from Measure M, a ballot proposal passed handsomely last November to increase the sales tax by 0.5% to pay for public transport. Growing congestion and reduced state and federal funding have spurred other cities to do the same. Voters in Atlanta and Seattle also passed transit referendums in November. But they are dwarfed by the Los Angeles measure, which is expected to come into effect in July and collect a whopping $120 billion for transport over the next 40 years. It is not before time. Los Angeles County's population has grown fast over the past few decades, making awful traffic worse. According to the Texas A&M Transportation Institute, a research group, residents of Los Angeles and nearby Anaheim spent a cruel average of 80 hours in jams in 2014, up from 58 hours in 1985. A study in 2016 by INRIX, a traffic analytic firm, found that Los Angeles had the worst traffic in the world. One campaign ad for Measure M seductively promised to reduce daily time spent snarled up by 15%. Some experts are skeptical, however. Measure M is the 4th sales tax increase for financing public transport to be approved by county voters in the past 40 years. Reviews of the previous efforts are mixed. Despite the introduction of 8 new railways and bus routes since 1990, passenger numbers on public transport have declined since their peak in 1985, when subsidies expired that kept bus fares artificially low. That year, 497 million journeys were made on Los Angeles County's bus and rail system. In 2016, the figure was 416 million, although, in the intervening years, the county's population had grown by 2 million. According to data from the Census Bureau, in 2015, 83% of workers in Los Angeles drove to work alone or in carpools, while less than 7% used public transport. Ethan Elkind, a law professor and author of Railtown, The Fight for the Los Angeles Metro Rail and the Future of the City, points out that passenger numbers on public transport have been declining nationwide. He adds that some new rail extensions, financed by a sales tax measure passed in 2008, have not yet started operation. But James Moore, who directs the Transportation Engineering Program at the University of Southern California, is more pessimistic. He believes politics has inspired the county to invest too much in rail while ignoring buses. Buses, he believes, are a much more cost-effective way to move people around sprawling Los Angeles, which is largely zoned for single-family housing rather than the dense clusters that might encourage rail travel. On 2 points, there is broad consensus. First, if Measure M is to get results, zoning around transport corridors needs to allow for denser development. Second, the Los Angeles Transit Authority needs to take the politically risky step of favoring public transport passengers who are often poor. 71% of them are Latino, over car drivers, who are more numerous and generally wealthier. A good example of the present bias is that the long-awaited railway from downtown to the Pacific stops for red lights to let cars pass.
United States.
Lexington. John Kasich's lament. A vanquished Republican moderate ponders how to make America united again.
When historians look back at the earthquake that shook American politics in 2016, two books deserve recognition as important early warnings. The first, Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam, was published way back in 2000. With the prescience of a ranch hound growling at a far-off tremor, Mr. Putnam, a political scientist, reported that Americans were living increasingly solitary lives, slumped in front of televisions or surfing the internet, rather than competing in bowling leagues or volunteering for such civic groups as the Knights of Columbus. The second book, clanging like a ranch bell as the first tremors arrived, was The Big Sort: Why the Clustering of Like-Minded America is Tearing Us Apart, by Bill Bishop. Published in 2008, this reported that when Americans emerge, blinking from their TV dens, they increasingly inhabit communities which share their partisan, religious or cultural views. In the presidential election of 1976, some 27% of Americans lived in landslide counties, which Jimmy Carter either won or lost by at least 20 percentage points. By 2004, when George Bush narrowly won re-election, 48% of counties saw landslides. Now comes a third book, which seeks in effect to synthesize the lessons of the first two. It is written by John Kasich, the Republican governor of Ohio, and the last presidential primary contender to concede defeat as Donald Trump seized his party's nomination. The new work, Two Paths, America Divided or United, reflects Mr. Kasich's image as a folksy blue-collar conservative with a conscience. It could be summarized in a single, faith-tinged injunction: love your neighbor. The 24-hour news cycle being what it is, the book has mostly been passed for clues as to whether Mr. Kasich might run for president in 2020, especially if Mr. Trump does not seek a second term. Mr. Kasich, a former congressman and Fox News TV host, has coyly told interviewers, "You don't close the door on anything." In truth, Mr. Kasich has probably had his moment. He won one state in the presidential primaries, his own. Many Republicans cannot abide the way he casts hardline opponents as unchristian. Mr. Kasich likes to say that when politicians die, St. Peter will ask what they did for the poor, not how they shrank government. Still, Mr. Kasich's book matters, in part as a reassuringly human account of life at the epicenter of a political quake. He describes taking part in presidential primary debates in which rivals wallowed in the mud, lied, called each other liars, and disparaged each other's character. Up under the TV lights, he reports, "It was just nuts." He sounds equally human when watching rivals endorse Mr. Trump, a man they had previously called utterly amoral and a cancer on conservatism. Mr. Kasich, normally a gruff sort, tactfully calls this surrender surprising. Alas, two paths matters even more because it fails in its stated aim, to show how America can be united. The son of a postman from a small town in Pennsylvania, Mr. Kasich frets that Americans have fallen out of the habit of caring for one another, instead living with their heads down and expecting far-off government leaders to solve such problems as the opiate addictions ravaging Middle America. To explain why democracy feels gridlocked, Mr. Kasich points to partisans who now consume political news like a hobby and who use primary elections to punish legislators who cross party lines. The problem is that solving the bowling alone crisis, even if it can be done, may not fix the big sort problem. When Americans debate such issues as government welfare, it is not enough for them to love their neighbours. The larger challenge is to love compatriots who are not their neighbours. When polled on such issues as immigration, gun rights, climate change, or welfare for the poor, Trump-voting rural America and Democratic-leaning cities and inner suburbs sound like two different countries. Worse, the two Americas increasingly do not know or like each other. A divide made worse by Mr. Trump, who depicts cities as hellholes of dysfunction stalked by murderous immigrants. In an interview, Mr. Kasich's solution is to talk about questions of common humanity that trouble all Americans. He cites children who arrive hungry at school, drug addiction, and human trafficking. He wants to see more voluntary civic actions like mentoring young people, donating to food banks, or shaming employers into keeping jobs in America. In the meantime, gulfs grow wider. In 2016, fully 60% of voters lived in landslide counties that went for Mr. Trump or Hillary Clinton by a 20-point margin. Damagingly, for Mr. Kasich's love conquers all thesis, any reporter who covered last year's election can also testify that Mr. Trump's divisive rhetoric created a powerful sense of community among his followers. It is true that Trump rallies were darkly angry festivals of fear-mongering about the other, but seen another way, enthusiastic citizens were swept up in a common cause as rarely before, in their Make America Great Again hats and Trump That Bitch t-shirts. The faithful were not bowling alone. Today, the left is seeing a wave of civic activism and energy inspired by rage and disgust at President Trump. Pushed on this paradox, Mr. Kasich is honest enough to say that America faces a cultural problem that will not be solved overnight. Political parties see profit in gerrymandering districts to make them super safe, he sighs. The media saw profit in covering Mr. Trump's worst excesses. He chides religious leaders in the faith business for sowing divisions. Remarkably, he criticises the public too, who want to be reinforced in their beliefs, and so choose to inhabit partisan bubbles and forward fake news items without compunction. Fixing America is on us, writes Mr. Kasich, urging citizens to take more responsibility and shun strongmen vowing to solve all problems. But what happens when there is no American us anymore? To that, he offers no answer.
The Americas.
The Economist, April 29th to May 5th, 2017. In the Americas section, Canada and the United States, food fight, Brazil's environment, tree-muffled process, Bayo on the great re-election debate, and more.
The Americas.
Canada and the United States. Food fight. Donald Trump takes aim at his northern neighbour.
Canada, what they've done to our dairy farm workers, it's a disgrace, snapped Donald Trump from the Oval Office on April 20th. Mr. Trump had just heard complaints from American producers of ultra-filtered milk used to make cheese and yoghurt, who said they were shut out of the regulated Canadian market after a change in the rules. "We will not stand for this," Mr. Trump tweeted a few days later. Ron Versteeg, who along with his brother milks 120 Holstein cows at their farm near Ottawa, does not seem perturbed. "That's the US-Canada relationship," he says affably. "They take a dig, we take a dig." Canada's Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, has tried to sound equally unruffled since the United States elected its protectionist president last November. He had grounds for confidence. While Mr. Trump encouraged voters to blame their grievances on Mexico, the third partner in the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, he was much gentler towards the United States' northern neighbour. "The situation with Canada is much less severe than with Mexico," he told Mr. Trudeau during a visit to Washington in February. "The trade relationship just needs tweaking." Mr. Trump's tweaks are starting to feel like kicks. Alongside dairy farmers, he put loggers and energy producers on his Canadian enemies list and launched an investigation of imported steel, of which Canada is the biggest single supplier. On April 24th, the United States Commerce Department imposed preliminary duties averaging 20% on imports of Canadian softwood lumber used to build houses. 2 days later, newspapers reported that Mr. Trump was about to sign an order to withdraw from NAFTA. After hurried telephone calls with Mr. Trudeau and Mexico's President Enrique Peña Nieto, he dropped that plan, at least for now. But the threat remains, and Canada is vulnerable. The United States and Canada traded $635 billion worth of goods and services last year. 3/4 of Canada's goods exports went to the United States. Its access to the American market helped attract $37 billion Canadian dollars, that's $27 billion, of net foreign investment in 2016. The reconstruction of trade barriers would put all that in jeopardy. The Canadian dollar weakened after Mr. Trump fired off his salvos. Stephen Poloz, the governor of the central bank, told a committee of the Canadian Senate in April that American protectionism is the biggest threat to the economy. In fact, some of Mr. Trump's targets are well chosen. His swipe at dairy farmers is in part an attack on Canada's absurdly complex system of supply management, which matches production to demand and limits imports through quotas and tariffs. What hurt American farmers was a deal struck by Canadian farmers and regulators to allow a new, lower price for products that compete with ultra-filtered milk. Similar rules protect egg and poultry producers. Mr. Trudeau points out that the United States has a surplus of more than $400 million in dairy trade with Canada. That does not make supply management defensible. Mr. Trump has less justification for attacking foreign steelmakers. The rights and wrongs of the softwood lumber dispute, which dates back to 1982, are murkier. American loggers have long complained that their Canadian competitors pay too little to harvest trees, which grow mostly on public land. The two countries have struck temporary deals, the last of which expired in October 2015, without resolving the underlying disagreement. The United States has used tariffs before to force Canada to cap exports. These long-running irritants are now part of the much bigger confrontation triggered by Mr. Trump's determination to renegotiate NAFTA. No one in Canada or Mexico knows just what the United States will demand. In March, the acting United States Trade Representative sent a vaguely worded draft letter to Congress with 40 ideas for revising the agreement. They include eliminating NAFTA's dispute settlement mechanism, which has not been as tough on lumber subsidies and other Canadian practices as the United States wants, and making it easier for public agencies in the United States to buy American. Mr. Trump's mixed signals on scrapping NAFTA add to the confusion. Some Canadians yearn for a tougher line from Mr. Trudeau. "When you're dealing with a bully, at some point you have to stop backing up," admonished Thomas Mulcair, leader of the opposition New Democratic Party. Mr. Trudeau would rather charm the Trump administration than confront it. Ministerial visits have multiplied since the inauguration. Mr. Trudeau has joined Ivanka Trump, the first daughter, at a Broadway show and at a meeting of a newly created bilateral women's group. He promises a thoughtful, fact-based conversation on trade. Millions of American jobs depend on trade with Canada, he notes. Canada was the biggest buyer of American goods last year. The car industry straddles the border. Canada, along with Mexico, will no doubt point out that the United States is no free market paragon. Though it does not have supply management for dairy products, it subsidises maize and cottonseed, which go into animal feed. We know all their tricks, says Mr. Versteeg. Canada is bracing for the possibility that Mr. Trump may carry out his most aggressive threats. One response is to diversify trade away from the United States, but that will be hard, given that it is the world's largest economy and on Canada's doorstep. Pierre Trudeau, Justin's father, who was Prime Minister with a short break from 1968 to 1984, tried to reduce American economic and cultural influence. But Canada is more dependent on trade with the United States now than it was then. It hopes that new trade accords will change that. An agreement with the European Union is due to take effect this year. Canada is holding exploratory talks with China and India. It may join a revived Trans-Pacific Partnership, an 11-country pact from which the United States withdrew when Mr. Trump took office. But freer trade with far-flung countries cannot make up for bad ties with Canada's neighbour. Whatever happens, Mr. Versteeg is confident that his government will stand up for dairy farmers, a small but influential group in Ontario and Quebec. He likens Mr. Trump to a hockey player who repeatedly pokes an injured opponent's sore spot. They're just going to tap it every chance they get. He thinks Canada will skate through the pain, as it always has. But Mr. Trump may have changed the game.
The Americas.
Venezuela. Rotten tomatoes. Propaganda isn't what it used to be.
In weeks of almost daily protests, opponents of Venezuela's authoritarian regime have found different ways to express their anger. They have held raucous banner-waving marches, a silent demonstration and a sit-in on Caracas's main roads. At least 29 people have died since March in the worst unrest in 3 years. Many of these were killed by armed gangs that support the government called colectivos. The protests persist because the government has made life intolerable. Shortages of food and medicine are acute. The murder rate is probably the world's highest and democracy has been extinguished. But all is well in the world of Nicolás Maduro, the country's much-loathed president. While chaos engulfs Venezuela's cities, his social media team has been seeking to humanize the dictator with video vignettes that emphasize his homespun origins and simple wisdom. In one video posted on his Facebook page, he rhapsodizes on the innocence of childhood as he perches awkwardly on a playground swing. In another, he admires a panorama of an apparently tranquil Caracas from the safety of a cable car gondola. Sometimes he takes to the wheel of his car with his wife Celia Flores sitting glumly beside him. This is an occasion to reminisce about his early career as a bus driver. The social media stream is an addition to the information arsenal of Chavismo, the leftist movement founded by the late Hugo Chavez and carried on with less elan by Mr. Maduro. Its main weapon was and remains state control of television, which repeats endlessly the risible claim that Venezuela is a victim of an economic war. Broadcasts by the president can last as long as a double feature. Lacking Chavez's charisma, Mr. Maduro hopes to come across as cuddly in his up-close and personal videos and a salsa show on radio. Venezuelans are not beguiled. The films show a falta de respeto, or lack of respect, many say. I think he actually enjoys laughing at us, says Daniel Torres, an engineering student. Venezuelans are especially annoyed by a video of the president, resplendent in a white tracksuit, playing catch with Diosdado Cabello, the thuggish former president of the National Assembly. A democratic game, a constitutional game, sniggers Mr. Cabello. He helped plan many of the government's assaults on democracy, including a botched attempt in March to transfer the powers of the legislature, now controlled by the opposition, to the Supreme Court, which takes orders from the government. We are working, promises Mr. Maduro as he tosses the ball back to his partner in misrule. For Alberto Barrera Tisca, an essayist, the video shows the decadence of Chavismo. The images of frolicking, well-fed politicians are an insult to the poverty of Venezuelans, most of whom have lost weight over the past 2 years, he has written. One of Mr. Maduro's clips shows him driving through a poor neighbourhood of Caracas to show off the apparent cheerfulness of the locals. A wall scrawled with the words Maduro, murderer of students, is clearly visible as he drives past, but not to the oblivious president. Chavistas used to be good at propaganda. Now they cannot even get that right.
The Americas.
Brazil's environment. Tree-muffled praças. A mayor tries to make the city greener.
The phrase concrete jungle might have been coined for São Paulo. Brazil's megalopolis has 2.6 square metres, that's 28 square feet, of green space for each of its 11 million inhabitants, a tenth as much as New York, and a fifth of what the World Health Organization recommends. As with wealth, greenery is unequally distributed. Rich central districts, many with jardim or garden in their names, have more trees than residents. In Itaim Paulista, on the poor eastern periphery, there is 1 for every 17 people. João Doria, the mayor since January, wants more foliage. In March, he inaugurated the first section of what will become the world's biggest green corridor. The vertical gardens, sprouting from wall-mounted pockets made from felt, will stretch for 3.5 kilometres, that's 2.2 miles, down Avenida 23 de Maio, a congested 10-lane road in the city's centre. They're expected to absorb as much carbon dioxide as 3,300 trees. In elections last year, Mr. Doria, a marketing tycoon, defeated a left-wing mayor, Fernando Haddad, who was fond of cycle lanes, but did little to make the city greener. Under his administration, spending on the environment fell from 1.4% of the budget to 0.3%. Public parks and nurseries fell into disrepair after Mr. Haddad allowed maintenance contracts to expire last August. His mayoralty was depressing, says Ricardo Kajim, a landscape architect who runs a blog called São Paulo Trees. He is optimistic about Mr. Doria. The centre-right mayor named Gilberto Natalini, a member of the Green Party, as the city's environment secretary, and boosted his budget by a third to 200 million reais, that's $62 million. Mr. Doria revived moribund partnerships with the state government to clean storm drains and line them with vegetation. With money tight because of Brazil's recession, Mr. Doria is enlisting his fellow businessmen to spread the vegetation. One group promised to give 1 million saplings, which would more than double the number of trees on the streets. Mr. Doria is badgering 2 developers to allow a plot they own in a rundown part of the city centre to become a park, in return for land elsewhere. He wants private firms to maintain the city's 107 parks, perhaps in exchange for displaying their corporate logos. On April 24th, he invited Arnold Schwarzenegger to São Paulo to arm-twist American companies into backing green projects. Mr. Doria may be hoping that Paulistanos will someday hail him as the Germinator.
The Americas.
Bayo, the great re-election debate. Relaxing term limits has been bad for democracy.
If you need a pretext for a political climb down in Latin America, they don't come much better than a plea from the Pope. That was the excuse that Horacio Cartes, Paraguay's president, used to drop his plan to run for a second consecutive term in 2018, which required changing the constitution. He was inspired to desist, he wrote to the Archbishop of Asunción this month, by Pope Francis's call for peace and dialogue. An attempt to ram the change through Congress had provoked a riot in which the Parliament building was set on fire. After 10 days of hesitation, during which Mr. Cortez's Colorado party failed to withdraw the amendment, on April 26th, Congress voted unanimously to reject it. But Paraguay's decision will not quiet debate across Latin America about whether or not to allow presidential re-election. When in the 1970s and 1980s Latin America emerged from a period of dictatorship, its politicians were keen to place limits on executive power. Most countries either barred presidents from seeking re-election or allowed them to do so only after waiting out at least one term. Since then, there has been a gathering trend in the region to relax term limits. 5 countries, including Brazil and Argentina, now allow a second consecutive term, while 7 allow non-consecutive re-election. In Venezuela, Hugo Chavez won a referendum to abolish term limits altogether. Ecuador's Congress agreed to do so from 2021. In Nicaragua and Honduras, courts have abolished term limits by ruling that barring re-election violates constitutional freedoms, a questionable route to making such a fundamental change to the rules of democracy. Those who favour re-election argue that it makes presidents more accountable, that it offers voters the chance of keeping a president if they so wish, and that it offers political and thus economic stability. Yet the costs of relaxing term limits are becoming ever clearer. Most obviously, Venezuela and Nicaragua are now in effect dictatorships. Elsewhere, there are more subtle ill effects from allowing even one chance to run for re-election. The first is that in practice, incumbents have an unfair advantage. Of the 23 who ran for re-election since the mid-1980s, only 2, Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua in 1990 and Hipólito Mejía in the Dominican Republic in 2004, lost. Incumbents may benefit from a preference for the devil you know, but weak checks and balances probably matter more. Presidents may abuse public resources and interfere with electoral authorities. Javier Corrales and Michael Penfold, 2 political scientists, looked at 125 elections in 18 Latin American countries between 1953 and 2012. They found that being an incumbent widened the advantage over the nearest rival by an average of 11.2% of the vote. They also found that a 1% increase in public spending in the election year expanded the margin of victory by 1.3 percentage points. That can make all the difference. Dilma Rousseff raised primary public spending, i.e. before interest payments, in Brazil by 6% in real terms in 2014 and won an ill-fated second term by a margin of just 3.3 percentage points. Former presidents who run again after an interval, as 38 did between 1998 and 2006, are less assured of victory. But they act as bed blockers, preventing political renewal. That matters. Surveys find increasing voter disillusion with the political establishment in many countries. Relaxing term limits coincided in part with the commodity boom, which brought faster economic growth to many Latin American countries. Endowed with extra revenues that enabled them to fulfill campaign promises, presidents tended to be popular. That is no longer the case. So Latin America may revert to its historical norm of weak presidents and move back to tighter term limits. Latin American countries employ the unusual and awkward combination of a directly elected president and a legislature chosen by proportional representation. As a result, the president's supporters often make up a minority in a multi-party Congress. That has increased the risk that a president will be impeached, as 8, including Ms. Rousseff, have been since 1992. Yet, as democracy takes root in most Latin American countries, presidents and opposition-dominated legislatures have often managed to get along. A bigger risk, as Juan Pablo Luna and Alberto Vergara, two other political scientists, point out, is that political parties become less good at channeling the demands of rapidly changing societies. Allowing re-election is likely to exacerbate that problem. Latin American countries should think long and hard before doing so.
Asia.
The Economist, April 29th to May 5th, 2017. In the Asia section. Indian politics, the hapless opposition. Gay rights in South Korea, 2 steps back. Banyan on bullying South Korea. And more.
Asia.
Indian politics. Defeats, defections, and disorganisation. Dynasticism, personality cults, and plain incompetence have reduced the opposition to near irrelevance.
2 years ago, voters in Delhi, the Indian capital, whistled a warning to Prime Minister Narendra Modi. It was less than a year since he had led his Bharatiya Janata Party, or BJP, to power in a sweeping general election triumph. Yet suddenly, at the very seat of the national government, a puny upstart party running a shoestring anti-corruption campaign had nabbed no fewer than 67 of the 70 seats in the city's main legislature. The BJP had captured a paltry 3. Could it be that Mr. Modi's vaunted electoral juggernaut was not invincible after all? This was certainly what the critics of the Hindu nationalist BJP hoped, yet in test after test since then, from obscure by-elections to the campaign for the State Assembly in Uttar Pradesh, with a population of 220 million, the party has surged relentlessly ahead. In addition to the national government, the BJP and its allies now control 17 out of India's 31 state legislatures, together representing more than 60% of the country's people. At a recent party rally in the eastern state of Odisha, Amit Shah, the BJP's grizzled master strategist, actually evoked the Jagannath Temple, a local landmark that inspired the word juggernaut, as he vowed the party would capture every state from Panchayat, village council, to Parliament. Not surprisingly, it is now among the opposition that alarms are sounding. The latest bell, again in Delhi, rang on April 26th, as results emerged of voting at another level of local government, the city's 3 municipal corporations. The BJP won more than 2/3 of seats. The feisty upstart of 2015, the Aam Aadmi, or Common Man Party, that's AAP, was left sputtering that someone must have tampered with the voting machines. That is unlikely. The Election Commission of India, which is responsible for the gadgets, enjoys a reputation for probity rare among the country's public institutions. This is not to say that the BJP does not play rough in the contact sport that is Indian politics. On the contrary, Mr. Modi's party is tenacious and aggressive. Delhi's AAP government, for instance, has found itself hamstrung by varied forms of obstruction from the BJP-led central government, not to mention by scores of spurious lawsuits and repeated police raids and investigations. Many AAP supporters seem to have understood the message. Like it or not, the underdog is not a party that can get stuff done. Totting up the recent losses of India's opposition, however, it is clear that they themselves must also bear much of the blame. At every turn, they have been not just outmuscled, but outwitted by the BJP. Worse, all too often, India's opposition parties have scored own goals, whether by way of corruption scandals, messy defections, internal squabbles, or simply the failure to recognise that unless they join forces, the BJP will indeed run them over. We'd been working on the assumption that Modi will be a shoo-in in 2019, says a foreign diplomat. We're now wondering if he won't be in 2024. Aside from the AAP, the party with the most egg on its face is Congress, the oldest and long the grandest of parties in India. For decades following independence in 1947, Congress, like the BJP today, dominated politics at every level. It remains the only party aside from the BJP with a nationwide presence. The two parties' multiple rivals are all regional or local political forces. But after years of slow slippage, Congress's grasp seems in many parts of the country to have relaxed entirely. It currently controls just 6 state legislatures, only 2 of them in sizable states. In recent elections, it has frequently trailed a distant third or worse. With astonishing regularity, Indian newspapers report stories of Congress grandees abandoning the party, all too often to join the BJP. Over the past year alone, Congress has lost control of 6 states, 4 of them, Arunachal Pradesh, Assam, Goa and Manipur, because local party leaders switched sides. In the last 2, they abandoned Congress even though it had just won state elections. The rival BJP simply moved faster to form a government, luring defectors with promises of cabinet posts even as Congress's leadership in Delhi dithered over how to dole out offices. In the mountainous state of Arunachal Pradesh last year, 43 Congress deputies defected en masse to join a new BJP-allied party. In Assam, rebellious younger Congress leaders helped swing voters to the BJP, which they joined after complaints about the ageing local Congress boss fell on deaf ears. Many have blamed Congress's woes on the lingering hold of the Gandhi dynasty. Its current figurehead, Rahul Gandhi, is the son, grandson and great-grandson of previous prime ministers. Yet semi-feudal family politics afflicts many of India's parties. A nasty spat in the reigning Yadav family weakened the previous ruling party in Uttar Pradesh, paving the way for the BJP's crushing victory in the state assembly elections. The ruling party in the southern state of Tamil Nadu is currently embroiled in succession issues. The leadership of its main local rival is also a family affair. A related opposition handicap is its emphasis on personality over principle. In some cases, this has left parties floundering for relevance once their exalted leader dies. It has also opened some to the charge that they are mere vote-getting machines that do not stand for anything. The Trinamool Congress of West Bengal, a state ruled with an iron fist by the party's founder, Mamata Banerjee, is based on an insubstantial mix of populism and Bengali pride. In the southern states of Kerala and Tamil Nadu, power has for decades alternated between 2 parties with very similar ideologies. On all these scales, the BJP stands out as different. True, it has built a cult of personality around Mr. Modi, along with other top leaders in the party who spent long apprenticeships as volunteers with Hindu nationalist groups before entering politics. However, the Prime Minister remains a celibate bachelor. There will not be a Modi dynasty. Like it or not, too, his party does stand for something. The BJP believes that for India to be strong, it must abandon the elitist, secular socialism of the Congress years and embrace a less inclusive, more authentic Hindu identity. But above all, India's ruling party enjoys unmatched discipline and organising power. A disappointed Aam Aadmi supporter in the prosperous Delhi district of Vasant Vihar says they didn't put up a single flag or poster. By contrast, neat, polite BJP workers went door to door, ringing his bell 3 times.
Asia.
Politics in Australia. The vanishing Liberal. The Prime Minister is not the man he used to be.
Malcolm Turnbull has always seemed to be what Australians call a small L Liberal. Unlike many in the Liberal Party, which, despite its name, is Australia's main conservative force, he was a defender of progressive causes. In 1986, as a lawyer, he successfully challenged a bid by the British government to prevent the publication in Australia of the memoir of a former British spy. He led the failed campaign in 1999 for Australia to become a republic, And, unlike his fellow Liberal and predecessor as Prime Minister Tony Abbott, he has no doubts about global warming. Yet since becoming Prime Minister 2 years ago, Mr Turnbull seems to have jettisoned many of his small L views. The most obvious reversal concerns immigration. In 2013, when a government led by Labour, now the main opposition party, sought to curb temporary work visas known as 457s, Mr Turnbull called the visas the heart of skilled migration. He dismissed as chauvinistic rhetoric claims that they robbed Australians of jobs. Yet Mr Turnbull recently announced sharp restrictions on 457s. Most recipients will no longer be able to apply for permanent residency, and the number of eligible professions has been cut by a third. Actors, biochemists, detectives, metallurgists and web developers are among those who need no longer apply. To oblige immigrants to learn Australian values, the government wants to add questions on topics like child marriage, domestic violence and female circumcision to the test they must take before they become citizens. Mr Turnbull described all this as standing up for Australian jobs and Australian values. The sudden blast of Australia First rhetoric has left many asking what Mr Turnbull really stands for. When he led a rebellion among Liberal MPs to unseat Mr Abbott, Mr Turnbull promised ideas that will excite the Australian people. He said he would attract the world's best innovative talent to Australia. He encouraged Australians to embrace a national culture of risk-taking. At first, the government's opinion poll ratings soared, having tanked under the unpopular Mr Abbott, but after an election in July, Mr Turnbull clings to power with a majority of just one in the lower house of Parliament and a minority in the upper house. Mr Turnbull's straitened circumstances seem to have left him wary of exciting ideas and averse to risk-taking. He depends on the parliamentary support of Mr Abbott, still an MP, and the right wing of the party which is constantly sniping at him. Perhaps as a result he has abandoned all sorts of positions that used to distinguish him from Mr Abbott. He used to advocate a market-driven mechanism obliging polluters to cut emissions of greenhouse gases. Now he has embraced Mr Abbott's much criticised alternative, a 2.5 billion Australian dollar, that's 1.8 billion US dollar, public fund to pay businesses to curb emissions. By the same token, he used to argue that Parliament should legalise gay marriage. Now he wants to hold a plebiscite first, just as Mr Abbott proposed. Mr Turnbull's U-turns make some wonder if he ever stood for much besides winning power. Norman Abjuranson, a political historian at the Australian National University, thinks the Liberal Party has a narrative problem. It appears to be in steady retreat from the political centre that once looked like Turnbull's home ground advantage. At any rate, its polls have slipped. It now trails the Labour Party. Australia's three previous Prime Ministers, Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard of the Labour Party and Mr Abbott, all lost power when their MPs decided to replace them in the hope of improving their electoral prospects. Mr Rudd also lost an election after a second stint in office. Voters have grown dismayed at such shenanigans, but Mr Abjuranson still wonders if Liberal MPs are disgruntled enough that time might already have run out for Malcolm Turnbull. Tony Burke, a Labour MP, says Mr Turnbull has become the protagonist of the same sort of Shakespearean tragedy that consumed his predecessors. I watched it unfold, and we're watching it unfold again. For now, the main thing keeping Mr Turnbull in office may be the lack of a plausible replacement.
Asia.
Human rights in South Korea. Forget North Korea. The real danger is gay soldiers, apparently.
It is 2017. Moon Jae-in just opposed homosexuality, thundered the headline of a newspaper following a live television debate among South Korea's presidential candidates. Gay sex is legal in South Korea but stigmatized. Mr. Moon, a former human rights lawyer and the Liberal candidate who leads the polling for the election on May 9th, had just confirmed that he disapproved of it. Mr. Moon's statement caused a stir on social media, but his view is not that unusual. Of the 5 main presidential candidates, only Shim Sang-jung of the Justice Party, the only woman running, has expressed support for gay rights. A decade ago, a bill outlawing discrimination on various grounds founded because sexual orientation was one of them. MPs have blocked it twice more since then. Last week, representatives of Mr. Moon and 3 rivals attended a Protestant public policy forum. All made statements against gay rights, in keeping with the stance of many of South Korea's influential churches. The denunciations came on the heels of a report from an NGO called the Military Human Rights Center of Korea, which claims that the army is hunting down gay soldiers. The Military Criminal Act bans soldiers, most of whom are conscripts, from engaging in gay sex, which it labels disgraceful conduct punishable by imprisonment of up to 2 years. At least 32 soldiers are being investigated and 1 has been charged. That, the report claims, is because the army is actively seeking to weed out gay soldiers. The report alleges that it obliged gay soldiers to reveal the names of gay comrades, combed their mobile phones for leads, and even mounted sting operations using gay dating apps, all of which appear to be against the army's regulations and may also be illegal. The army protests that the claims are untrue and that it has not broken the law. Its ban on gay sex, it says, is designed to conserve a wholesome lifestyle for soldiers. Han Ga-ram, a human rights lawyer, says the measure is tantamount to criminalising homosexuality. Activists say it violates the Constitution's guarantee of equal treatment for all citizens. They have challenged it in the Constitutional Court 3 times since 2002, to no avail. A 4th complaint is on its way through the courts. Judges, generals and politicians may be unbending, but public opinion is shifting. Between 2010 and 2014, support for same-sex marriage doubled among respondents in their 20s and 30s. Almost 3/4 in their 20s saw gay rights as a human rights issue. Mr. Han says that South Koreans are less afraid of speaking out since months of protests led to the impeachment in March of Park Geun-hye, the president, prompting the current election. Posters have appeared on the walls of universities in Seoul, the capital, calling for the release of the gay soldiers with the slogan, "Take me away too." Protesters waving rainbow flags and calling for Mr. Moon to apologise disrupted one of his campaign events this week. In the end, he did, but half-heartedly, saying he should not have been judgmental, but standing by his opposition to greater gay rights. Activists have taken to Gwanghwamun Square in central Seoul, where only recently Mr. Moon joined the rallies against Ms. Park, presenting himself as a figure of change. Angry banners there now demand of him, "Do you oppose me?"
Asia.
1 MDB. Cleaning up. A mammoth financial scandal is being brushed under the carpet.
For the past year, 1MDB, a Malaysian state investment firm at the heart of one of the world's biggest financial scandals, has been locked in dispute with IPIC, a sovereign wealth fund from the oil-rich emirate of Abu Dhabi, with which it was once chummy. Terse statements released on April 24th suggest the pair are finally making up. 1MDB has agreed to pay IPIC $1.2 billion, reportedly to settle a complaint that it reneged on the terms of a bailout IPIC provided in 2015. The two companies have also agreed to enter into good faith discussions about other disputed payments, which may total as much as $3.5 billion. Past dealings between 1MDB and IPIC are a focus for investigators hunting huge sums that have gone missing from the Malaysian state-owned company since its founding in 2009. In 2012, IPIC offered to guarantee loans that one MDB needed to acquire two power firms. But IPIC said last year that it had never received collateral and other monies supposedly due to it under this deal. Instead, one MDB appears to have wired payments to an account held by an unrelated shell company registered in the British Virgin Islands, which had adopted a name similar to that of one of IPIC's subsidiaries. Last July, investigators at America's Justice Department said they thought that this ruse had allowed conspirators to liberate more than $1.3 billion from one MDB's coffers. Opposition politicians in Malaysia maintained that the sum lost is in fact far greater. America alleges that former officials from both IPIC and 1MDB benefited from the swindle. They also claim that more than $200 million of the missing money went to an account controlled by Riza Aziz, the stepson of Najib Razak, Malaysia's Prime Minister, and that $30 million went to Mr. Najib himself. Both deny wrongdoing. That 1MDB and IPIC are beginning to bury the hatchet is probably a relief for bigwigs implicated in the affair, even if many humbler Malaysians are wondering how the billion or so dollars immediately due to IPIC will be found. Although investigations are continuing in America, Switzerland and Singapore, the authorities in Malaysia itself have charged no one in connection with any of 1MDB's dubious dealings. Mr. Najib fired an Attorney General looking into the scandal. The successor Mr. Najib appointed concluded that $681 million paid to Mr. Najib in 2013 was a donation from foreign royalty, not in any way related to 1MDB. Many voters in rural seats either do not understand the affair or do not care about it. It is rumoured that the Prime Minister will call a general election later this year in the hope of benefiting from the opposition's interminable squabbling. As things stand, he will probably clean up.
Asia.
Banyan. Fad vibes. North Korea and China are tilting the presidential race in South Korea to their disadvantage.
Any excuse for a party. On April 25th, North Korea celebrated the 85th anniversary of the founding of its glorious army. 10 days before, its young despot, Kim Jong-un, had marked the 105th birthday of his grandfather, Kim Il-sung, the country's founder, with a vast military parade. Mr. Kim loves fireworks too. He set off a ballistic missile in honour of his grandpa, though it fizzled on launch. Rumours of a nuclear test still hang in the air. Of North Korea's 5 underground blasts to date, the young Mr. Kim, in power since 2011, is responsible for 3. Mr. Kim's growing nuclear ambitions have agitated Donald Trump. This week, America's president called both his Chinese counterpart, Xi Jinping, and Japan's Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe, to discuss them. He also summoned the entire Senate to the White House for a briefing on the subject. And an American aircraft carrier, the USS Carl Vinson, has finally shown up for reassuring annual drills with South Korea, after an embarrassing incident in which American officials claimed it was on its way to the Korean peninsula, when in fact it was going in the other direction. Heaven knows South Korea needs the reassurance. For all the mutual intimidation between North Korea and America, the North is probably still a couple of years away from being able to attack the American mainland. The North's promise to make a super mighty preemptive strike against the Carl Vinson is bluster. South Korea, in contrast, has long faced an existential threat from North Korea's 20,000 artillery pieces and 1 million-strong army. The North's growing nuclear capability compounds the danger. Just because Seoul in spring, with its bustling craft markets and festive air, is a cheerful place, does not mean the threat is imaginary. Seoulites have simply learned to live under it. Among South Korean policymakers, the unease is palpable. It hardly helps that the country is in limbo after the impeachment in March of the president, Park Geun-hye. A presidential election will take place on May 9th. Meanwhile, only part of the unease is generated by the North. Mixed signals from America have unsettled as much as they have reassured. Yes, the Vice President, Mike Pence, recently glared across the demilitarized zone in solidarity with South Koreans. He also declared that all options were on the table in dealing with the North. Yet, in a later interview with the Washington Post, he rejected the idea of direct negotiations of the sort that have brought North Korea to the table in the past. Such negotiations were in keeping with South Korea's long attempt at engagement with the North, which for the decade after 1998 was known as the Sunshine Policy. Mr. Pence acknowledged that if America will not talk to North Korea, and if the North will not give up its nukes, then American military action in the form of a preemptive strike becomes more likely. For South Korea, that carries horrendous implications of a retaliatory attack. It was no comfort when Senator Lindsey Graham, one of the more thoughtful voices in Washington, said that a war in those circumstances would be terrible, but would at least be over there rather than here. Strategists in Seoul talk of uncertainty to the east, meaning America. They also refer to uncertainty to the west, meaning China. As they see it, America has not helped there either. Mr. Pence describes the Trump approach as not engagement with North Korea, but renewed and more vigorous engagement with North Korea's principal economic partner, i.e., China. Mr. Trump wants Mr. Xi to deliver a breakthrough with the North by applying ever more pressure until it abandons its nukes. Yet South Koreans point out two problems. First, the American approach misconstrues China's aim, which is not to bring Mr. Kim's regime to its knees, but just to get America and the North to talk to each other. Second, it fails to acknowledge China's ugly bullying of South Korea in the wake of the country's decision last year to approve an American missile defense system known as THAAD, which is designed to shoot down incoming North Korean missiles. China claims the system threatens its own security. The radar might see into Chinese territory. To South Koreans, this proves how China elevates its solipsistic and woolly concerns over a threat to the South's very existence. In protest at THAAD, the Chinese authorities have also encouraged a boycott of South Korean consumer goods and discouraged Chinese tour groups from visiting the South. Chinese hackers have been assaulting South Korean government websites. Such bullying has gone down badly. South Koreans used to admire China, but now, for the first time, opinion polls suggest they hold it in lower esteem than Japan, which colonized Korea and with which Seoul still bickers endlessly about the extent of colonial abuses. Meanwhile, North Korean and Chinese bullying are helping shape the presidential race. The longtime frontrunner, Moon Jae-in, a dovish progressive, promoted the Sunshine Policy in a former administration. He used to say he was willing to visit Pyongyang before Washington if elected president. Such talk is heard no more. Mr. Moon still favours engagement, including reopening the Kaesong Industrial Zone, which brings together South Korean capital and North Korean workers. But he has come around to THAAD, to which he sounded hostile at first, and about which many South Koreans still have their doubts. Indeed, the whole race is becoming more hawkish. Mr. Moon remains the front-runner, but An Cho-soo, a doctor and former software entrepreneur, has gained rapidly in the polls. He has attacked Mr. Moon for being soft on the North, including over Kaesong. Whoever wins, it looks as if Mr. Xi's and Mr. Kim's hostility will earn them the government they deserve in South Korea, one less inclined to humour them.
China.
The Economist, April 29th to May 5th, 2017. In the China section, poverty alleviation, getting harder. And corruption, a tycoon talks.
China.
Poverty. Stumbling along the last mile. China is trying a new approach to poverty.
Most of Tian Shuang's relatives are herding goats in the barren hills of Ningxia province, one of the poorest parts of western China. But last year, Mr. Tian came down to Minning, a small town in the valley, when the local government, as part of an anti-poverty programme, gave him a job growing mushrooms and ornamental plants in a commercial nursery garden. His name, address and income, 20,000 yuan a year, or $2,900, 6 times the minimum wage, are written on a board by its greenhouse door. Mr. Tian's name is also pinned up on the walls of the town hall, along with those of 409 other people in the area who, without help, would be living below the local poverty line of 3,200 yuan a year. This is about 40% above the national minimum, but still not enough to buy meat more than once a week or to spend on new clothes. The town lists the problems and requirements of each of its poor people. 37 are poor because of health problems. 77, including some of Mr. Tian's relatives, live in isolated, inhospitable areas. 95 are physically handicapped, and so on. Also listed is the help given by the government to each person, such as the provision of work, a solar generator, or a cow. Minning is a model town. Its poverty alleviation scheme was set up by Xi Jinping, China's president, between 1999 and 2002, when he was governor of Fujian, a wealthy province in the south. Fujian is twinned with Ningxia as part of a national attempt to spread expertise and money from rich to poor areas. The system that Minning pioneered is now spreading throughout China. It focuses on poor individuals and on drawing up specific plans for each, rather than merely helping poor places to develop in the hope that wealth will trickle down to the poorest. Other countries are trying this too, but China is one of the few developing nations with a bureaucracy big enough and bossy enough to do it well. China has been a hero of the world's poverty reduction efforts. It has eradicated poverty in cities, by its definition at least, and reduced the number of rural people below the official poverty line of 2,300 yuan a year at 2010 prices from 775 million in 1980 to 43 million in 2016. Its aim now is to have no one under the line by 2020. 2 years ago, Mr. Xi set this as one of the main jobs of his presidency. He calls it the baseline task for building a moderately prosperous society, which the Communist Party wants to create by its 100th birthday in 2021. Politically, poverty reduction matters because, as one party member says, unless China solves the problem of income inequality, the party's legitimacy will be questioned. The party owes its power to a revolt fuelled by the miseries of the countryside. It does not want to be accused of failing to fulfill its mandate to eliminate them. But the last stage of poverty reduction will be the most difficult. China's success so far has been based largely on economic growth, which has generated jobs for the able-bodied. The final stage will be costly and complicated, because many of the remaining poor are people who, because of physical or mental disabilities, cannot hold down jobs. A recent government survey found that 46% of China's poor were poor because of their health. Targeting individuals will help. By 2014, the government had compiled a poverty household registry of every person and household below the poverty line. The following year, it said a personalised poverty alleviation plan must be drawn up for everyone included. The Philippines and Mexico also have such registries. They can help with monitoring the status of the poor, identifying their needs and, in theory, preventing waste and corruption. There are signs that China's is indeed improving its main form of poor relief, which is called subsistence guarantee, or dibao. The dibao program has been notoriously inefficient. Many households that qualify for payments do not receive them because of corruption and bureaucratic failings. A survey by the World Bank found that between 2007 and 2009, just 10% of those that did get the dibao had household incomes below the poverty line, i.e. 90% did not qualify for the handouts they were getting. The system is also corrupt. In 2015, an official in Henan province was found to have 267 bank deposit books in the names of extremely poor people, from which he had misappropriated 500,000 yuan of welfare payments. But this may be changing. Poor people are getting more job training, as in Minning there has been a crackdown on corruption. Ben Westmore of the OECD, a club mostly of rich countries, recently trawled through household data from 5 provinces collected by researchers at Peking University. He found that in 2014, about a third of rural households receiving dibao payments were below the poverty line. Not good, but better than 10%. In Guangdong province in the south, an early starter in its focus on individual needs, more than half of recipients were below the line. Still, there is a long way to go. Most poor households still do not get dibao money. In the sample studied by Mr. Westmore, 3/4 of them did not. It hardly helps that the poverty registry and dibao data are kept by different government departments. The two are not linked. The dibao program, though financed largely by the national government, is administered locally. This means local areas may set their own poverty lines and benefits. Some thresholds are far below the national minimum, and payments are barely enough to live on. Total dibao spending peaked in 2013 and has been falling since then, partly because governments are getting stingier. China spends a mere 0.2% of GDP on the dibao system, far below comparable programs elsewhere. Indonesia's poverty relief costs 0.5% of GDP. Worse, some poor people are not even included in the registry. In a village of 100 poor households in Shanxi province, only 10 families are in it, friends of the party boss. If the registry is flawed, poverty relief is all the more likely to be flawed too. All these efforts are aimed only at extreme poverty in the countryside. The government claims the urban kind does not exist, i.e. that no one in cities has less than 2,300 yuan a year. But that minimum is too low for cities, where living costs are higher. Using more realistic thresholds, Mr. Westmore found that urban poverty was actually higher than rural poverty in 4 of the 5 provinces covered by the data he used. At current rates of reduction, more than 10 million fewer people annually in extreme poverty, Mr. Xi should be able to meet his target by 2020. It will be hailed as a great achievement. But huge government effort will still be needed to help the worse off. It will not be the end of poverty in China.
China.
Corruption. Fox and hounds. A tycoon's allegations are hitting the Communist Party where it hurts.
In China, tycoons are often privy to murky secrets. Their dealings inevitably bring them into close contact with officialdom. They know whose palms can be greased and who the real power brokers are in the shadowy world of Communist Party politics. They are careful, however, not to speak out. An angry politician can easily destroy a business and have a person jailed. No wonder, then, that many Chinese have been transfixed by the claims made by a self-exiled property magnate, Guo Wun-Gui, in a recent series of tell-all interviews and tweets, and that the party is trying hard to discredit him. The unproven allegations by Mr. Guo, who is also known as Miles Kwok, reached to the pinnacle of the party. He has accused security officials of corruption and claimed that the son of a former leader is hiding his shareholding in a large brokerage firm. Most shockingly, Mr. Guo says a relative of a current leader has been trotting the globe on a plane worth billions of yuan and playing around with women, in spite of the party's long-running campaign to curb profligacy among the elite and to rein in corruption. Chinese leaders are clearly rattled. The Foreign Ministry said last week that Interpol, an international body for police cooperation, had issued a red notice to members that Mr. Guo is a wanted man. He has reportedly been accused by China of bribing a spy chief, Ma Jian, who has been dismissed and is now in custody. A video purporting to show Mr. Ma admitting to wrongdoing and denouncing Mr. Guo has circulated on the internet in recent days, apparently with official blessing. Mr. Guo has denied bribing Mr. Ma. He says 8 members of his own family have been detained, and that 120 billion yuan, or $17 billion of his assets have been frozen. Several executives from his property company have been detained by police. Mr. Guo's outburst comes at a sensitive time for the President Xi Jinping, who is preparing for a party congress late this year, a hugely important opportunity for him to install his allies into the most important jobs. He does not want his efforts to be impeded by anything that could undermine his authority. This is evident from China's stepped-up efforts to gag critics and enemies of the state. It seems prepared to use any means. In February, Xiao Jianhua, a Chinese tycoon who made his fortune through ties to party leaders, was kidnapped in Hong Kong and taken to the mainland, where he is being held by police. Between 2014 and 2016, in an operation called Fox Hunt, China secured the repatriation of more than 2,500 fugitives. Many were from countries with which it has no formal extradition treaty. Mr. Guo professes to be unfazed by Interpol's notice. He appears to spend much of his time in America and likes to tweet pictures of himself looking fit. Many people in China are certainly undeterred by the government's efforts to block news about him. Mr. Guo's allegations are widely known. Freeweibo.com, a website that automatically monitors censorship of Weibo, a Twitter-like service, shows that Mr. Guo's name is the most searched-for term on the social media platform. If he keeps on talking, it will be hard for Mr. Xi to knock it down the rankings.
Middle East and Africa.
The Economist, April 29th to May 5th, 2017. In the Middle East and Africa section. Saudi Arabia, the smell of burnt rubber. Yemen's war, a nation falls apart. Birth control in Nigeria, condoms v conservatives, and more.
Middle East and Africa.
Saudi Arabia. The smell of burnt rubber. An embarrassing U-turn on economic reform.
Even at the height of the Arab Spring, the Saudi regime had few domestic opponents. At their best, they mustered a few hundred protesters to gather for a day of rage in March 2011 outside the Interior Ministry, demanding a freely elected parliament and a constitutional monarchy. Many of its organisers were later jailed. But fear is only part of the reason for absence of protest. In a kingdom which acts like a heavily armed charity, doling out cradle-to-coffin welfare, few see a reason to upset the falafel stand. 2/3 of Saudi Arabia's 21 million citizens are employed by the government and expect annual pay rises whether working or not. Confronted with vast deficits after the oil price collapsed in 2014, the king's favoured son, Mohammed bin Salman, set out to change all that. The 31-year-old, who serves as Deputy Crown Prince, Defence Minister and head of the committee that runs the economy, is widely considered to be Saudi Arabia's de facto ruler, given the great age, 81, of his father. His ministers called civil servants lazy, and not only unveiled a transformation plan with austerity measures, but actually began implementing them. The slashing of housing, vacation and sickness allowances last September reduced some salaries by a third. Utility bills rose as subsidies fell. This was not popular. If they had to tighten their belts, many muttered, why shouldn't the prince himself, who reportedly paid $500 million for a yacht in 2015? Activists on social media compared him to Gamal Mubarak, the ravenous son of the deposed Egyptian president. The prince's primacy, already dented by the bloody mess that his intervention in next-door Yemen's war has become, seemed in danger of being weakened. On April 22nd, the government performed a screeching U-turn, restoring most of the perks and bonuses enjoyed by all those government employees. By reducing the grumbling, Prince Mohammed may hope to regain the middle-class support he needs to bolster his position against opposition from senior princes who would rather that the king's nephew and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Nayef succeed Salman when the time comes. A wave of royal appointments, decreed the same day as the restoration of perks, further shifts the balance in the young prince's favour. His younger full brother, Prince Khalid, becomes ambassador to America, the kingdom's most important diplomatic post, helping cement Mohammed bin Salman's ties to the Trump administration. Mohammed bin Nayef enjoys the confidence of America's spooks, but under Mr. Trump they have been losing influence to the Pentagon. Critics might bemoan Prince Khalid's youth, 28, and inexperience, but at least he is a fighter pilot. Formally, the Crown Prince retains control of internal security, but by creating a new National Security Centre that answers directly to him, King Salman appears to be reducing his powers. So too does the promotion of Major General Ahmed Asiri, the Defence Ministry spokesman, who becomes Deputy Head of Intelligence. Some Saudi watchers speculate that King Salman might soon formally proclaim Mohammed bin Salman Crown Prince and pension off Mohammed bin Nayef. Might anyone stop him? In 1964, the Al Sauds deposed King Saud because of personal excesses and poor management, but the family took almost 7 years to agree to do it, and is far larger and less wieldy now. Backbiting could grow, not least over the young prince's readiness to cash in the family silver. Claims by analysts that he personally overvalued the Saudi oil company, Aramco, a fraction of which he intends to float next year by at least $500 billion, may be aimed at undermining confidence in his economic competence. But ultimately, the family remains loath to do anything that might compromise the absolute monarchy on which all their perks depend. More concerning is the possibility that necessary reforms are being sacrificed for the prince's personal ambition. A host of financiers led by the IMF had cheered his Vision 2030, announced last year, and aimed at cutting the public sector and preparing the kingdom for an age after oil. The Gulf can't do austerity measures, fumed a veteran investment banker after the kingdom announced the reversal. Despite a rise in the oil price to above $50, the budget remains deeply in deficit. Restoring the allowances will add a further $13 billion to a shortfall already projected at $86 billion, 12% of GDP. The government insists its finances are improving, but bankers say that capital is leaving the kingdom. The search for second passports by those who are fed up and want to leave is increasing. Growth is less than 1%, the lowest for almost 4 years. Admirers who once praised the prince now wonder whether his vision is to change the kingdom or just his title.
Middle East and Africa.
Yemen. Atomized. War is making Yemen fall apart.
From the balcony of his hilltop palace, the governor, Major General Ahmad bin Burek, surveys Mukalla, the port and capital of Yemen's largest province, Hadramaut. It is not yet his kingdom, but to mark the first anniversary of the expulsion of Al-Qaeda, the jihadist group that seized the city in 2015, he declared a public holiday and hosted thousands of grandees at a conference at which he pushed his demand for autonomy. Flunkies distribute badges with his portrait, hang banners proclaiming him leader along the city's highways, and organise military parades. Backed by the United Arab Emirates, or UAE, which last April wrested back control of the port in an assault by land and sea, he sees a new political map of Yemen emerging from 2 years of war. "We can't wait for them to liberate the rest of the country," he says. "If the conflict lasts much longer, Yemen will split into duwailat, or principalities. If so, it would be reverting to type. For 139 years, the British avoided the north and nannied 14 bickering sheikdoms across southern Yemen. When the British Empire withdrew, socialists in the south formed their own republic and proceeded to make it a crime even to communicate with northerners. South Yemen united with the more populous, tribal and rugged North Yemen only when the Soviet Union collapsed, leaving the south bereft of an external backer. After 27 years of forced but tempestuous marriage, its politicians have now latched onto the UAE, looking for separation again. Taking on responsibility for the south as part of the Saudi-led coalition to take Yemen from the northern Houthi rebel forces, the UAE has established at least 6 operating bases across southern Yemen. While the Saudis bombed from the air, the Emiratis put thousands of troops on the ground, trained perhaps 30,000 Yemeni fighters in and out of the country to fight the Houthis and Al-Qaeda, and pumped $2 billion into projects designed to revive a battered and neglected land. Southerners will never again be governed by Sana'a, Yemen's capital in the north, says Riyad Yassin, a former foreign minister and Yemen's ambassador to Paris on a visit to the UAE. Even the bottled water is called South. United in resentment of the north, Southerners agree on little else. Formerly, President Abd Rabbu Mansour Hadi, a general from the southern province of Abyan, rules over all the territories the coalition has recovered. Yet signs of his power are almost as hard to find in the south as in the rebel-held north. The odd poster bearing his image is strung from lampposts too high to tear down. Checkpoints fly the former South Yemen flag, not that of a united Yemen Mr. Hadi professes to govern. Mr. Hadi still controls the country's central bank and hoards some 400 billion Yemeni rials, about $1.6 billion he recently had printed in Russia. But local governors find ways to diversify. Frustrated at Mr. Hadi's reluctance to hand over Hadramaut's share of Yemen's oil revenues, its governor, like his Al-Qaeda predecessors, levies duties at Mukalla port. Surcharges on fuel imports for distribution countrywide, including to Sana'a where the rebels hold sway, he says, raise $16 million a month. He threatens to declare independence if Mr. Hadi refuses to grant him devolved powers by September. For Mr. Hadi, Aden, 550 kilometres, that's 350 miles west, is an even more urgent challenge. In the early summer of 2015, the Emirati Presidential Guard and their Yemeni protégés drove out northern rebels who had taken most of the city 4 months earlier. But the turf wars unleashed by liberation have dampened the celebrations. Mr. Hadi's son now inhabits the presidential palace in Aden. Mr. Hadi himself spends most of his time in Saudi Arabia, but in the rest of the city the governor, Aidarus al-Zubaydi, has asserted control. Much of the police force he has raised comes from his home province of Dali, north of Aden, whose tribesmen massacred Mr. Hadi's Abayan tribe in 1986. I override the president for the benefit of the city, Mr. Zubaidi explains. Amid the ruins, old vendettas have resurfaced. Over 3,700 people have been killed in the battles for Aden since 2015, say local doctors. In contrast to Makala's well-swept streets and whitewashed walls, rubbish and graffiti abound. Marginalised under Northern rule since 1990, Aden had long found solace in nostalgia. It recalled colonial times when it was the Arab world's premier port, with its first refinery, or the Soviet era when it had beach parties, and northern practices like cat chewing, the veil and polygamy were banned. The Emiratis have attempted to give the city a facelift, but while schoolgirls welcome their new computers and freshly painted classrooms, they worry about getting to school safely. Kidnappings, nighttime gunfire and explosions cause their trepidation. The presidential palace should be Aden's safest place, not its most frightening, says Kholoud Moussa, a 19-year-old whose school lies below. Southern secessionists maintain what order there is. Young men bristling with guns careen in pickups along pavements. Some officials now feel confident enough to move around Aden without bodyguards. But although the South Yemen flag is more common, Al-Qaeda's ensign also appears on alley walls. Soon after the Emiratis restored Aden's National Library, extremists blew it up. The previous governor was assassinated. The current one has survived multiple attempts. Yemen's rial has slumped against the dollar. Prices continue to rise. Mothers from poorer suburbs nurse shriveled bundles in hospital. Malnourishment was a fact of life before the war, but 8 children have starved to death in Aden's hospitals so far this year, against 11 all of last. Despite over $100 million worth of Emirati investment in generators, blackouts have increased. Power cuts last most of the day because Mr. Hadi refuses to pay for the fuel. He wants to stymie my efforts to deliver, says the governor, who accuses the president of recruiting Al-Qaeda fighters lest their Cold War heat up. At the airport, the governors and the president's men have already come to blows. The Emiratis are beginning to tire of their bickering wards. Officials who hoped that Aden would be a model for the rest of Yemen now fear that leaving the south on autopilot might only condemn the country to instability, and that might engulf the whole Arabian Peninsula. Thousands of fighters they have trained have gone AWOL after collecting their pay. Motivating recruits to push north is an uphill task, even with the payment of bonuses. Those who are happy to fight for their own homes seem unenthused about fighting for somebody else's. Why should we stand up another failed South Sudan? Asks an Emirati analyst. If you want to stabilise an area, the first thing you put right is the governance, says a former British diplomat in Yemen. That clearly has yet to happen.
Middle East and Africa.
Birth control in Nigeria. Condoms versus conservatives. Faith and tradition favour high fertility. Education pulls the other way.
Not everyone thinks birth control is a blessing. Boko Haram, a jihadist group that terrorizes northeastern Nigeria, deems artificial contraception to be a product of infidel learning and therefore forbidden. Its ideologues also believe that females should avoid school, marry early, sometimes while still children, and have lots of babies. In the dwindling areas the jihadists control, women have no choice. Even outside those areas, contraception is controversial. Boko Haram's ideology didn't spring from nowhere. Many Nigerian Muslims believe that pills and condoms are part of a Western plot to stop Muslims from multiplying. And in poor, rural areas, centuries of experience have taught people that having lots of children makes economic sense. They can be put to work in the fields. They will provide for their parents in old age, and given high rates of infant mortality, if you don't have several, you may end up with none. So the government in Kaduna, a majority Muslim state north of the capital Abuja, does not encourage people to have fewer children. That would be politically toxic, but it does offer free contraception and suggest that women might wish to pause between pregnancies. It also promotes girls' education, something that has caused fertility rates to fall more or less everywhere it has been tried. As recently as 2008, women in Kaduna expected to have 6.3 babies each over a lifetime. By 2013, this had fallen to 4.1, well below the national average of 5.7 that year. When Alheri Yusuf first heard about family planning from a relative, she hesitated. "I thought she didn't want me to give my husband more children," says the 33-year-old mother of four, as she waits for a contraceptive hormonal injection at a hospital in Kaduna. Then she realised that spacing her children would give her time to recover from childbirth. No one knows how many Nigerians there are. The World Bank says there were 182 million in 2015, but this estimate is based on the 2006 census, which was probably inflated. Politicians typically exaggerate the count to grab more parliamentary seats and government money for their regions. Most observers agree, though, that Nigeria's population is growing at a cracking 3% a year. Many Nigerians see this as a source of national pride and strength. But the economy ought to grow faster than the population, and last year it actually shrank thanks to cheap oil. To be prosperous as well as populous, Nigeria needs to educate its people better. This would also curb population growth, since well-schooled women tend to have fewer babies. In a sparse classroom in the city of Zaria, 15 adolescent girls, swathed in white hijabs, learn about reproduction, financial literacy, and how to say no. The course is run by a local NGO and paid for by the UN Population Fund. The girls say they want fewer children than when they started the sessions in September, so that they can educate them well. Most girls in the programme will finish secondary school and delay childbirth. Previous cohorts wed an average of 2.5 years later than peers. In places where female literacy has improved, child marriage and maternal mortality have duly fallen. Within Nigerian Islam, a debate rages between modernisers and obscurantists. The former may be winning. Lamido Sanusi, the Emir of Kano and a senior Muslim leader, has spoken out against child marriage and proposes a legal minimum age, there is currently none, of 18. Yusuf Ali, a cleric who joined a debate convened by the Emir, married his first wife when she was 14 and he was 26. But Mr. Ali, who has 4 wives and 38 children, now thinks girls should marry above the age of 15. He also favours family planning, so long as couples use withdrawal rather than modern contraception. He even agrees that girls should go to school.
Europe.
The Economist, April 29th to May 5th, 2017. In the Europe section, France's election, Macron, the happy gambler. Which alternative for Germany? Mutinies within mutinies. Charlemagne on illiberal Poland, and more.
Europe.
France's presidential election. The happy gambler. Win or lose, Emmanuel Macron has revolutionised French politics.
3 years ago, he was largely unknown to the public. Today, he is a step away from becoming France's president. Emmanuel Macron's remarkable rise from obscurity to favourite for the presidential election on May 7th carries symbolic value well beyond his homeland. If he defeats Marine Le Pen of the National Front, or FN, as polls suggest he will, the country will have shown the rest of the world not only that it can favour youth over seniority and optimism over fear, but that pro-European liberalism can still triumph over populism and nationalism. A former socialist economy minister and one-time investment banker, the 39-year-old Mr. Macron topped first-round voting on April 23rd with 24%. Ms. Le Pen came a close second with 21%. The pair, neither of whom comes from an established mainstream party, knocked out candidates from both of the two political groupings that have held the French presidency for the past 60 years. François Fillon, a former prime minister who ran for the Gaullist Republican Party, came third on 20%. Benoît Hamon, the socialist candidate and a former backbench rebel, sank to a dismal fifth place on 6%. Despite a late surge, the communist-backed Jean-Luc Mélenchon was narrowly held to fourth place on 19.6%. Mr. Macron's achievement defied all the rules. His tone on results night looked prematurely victorious. But those who joined him when he set up his political movement, En Marche, a year ago, appeared almost stunned this week. For months his campaign has been low cost and sometimes chaotic. His headquarters, filled with young people in sweatshirts and takeaway food boxes, has felt more like a start-up than a slick political machine. Nevertheless, in the end, he secured nearly as many votes as the Socialists and Republicans put together. Yet Mr. Macron's score was also the lowest for a leading first-round candidate since 2002. The results revealed a deeply fractured country. Mr. Macron won over voters in thriving big cities, where warehouses have been converted into tech hubs and cars are viewed as a menace. He came top in Paris with 35% against 5% for Ms. Le Pen, Rennes 32% to 7%, Bordeaux 31% to 7%, and Lyon 30% to 9%. His support was evenly spread across all age groups. It correlated with greater income, optimism and education. This is the France that feels at ease with Mr. Macron, a zealous pro-European who wants to reinforce ties with Germany, keep France part of the global trading system, support the transatlantic alliance and build cross-party support between left and right to unblock the economy. By contrast, nearly half of all voters backed one of the anti-system candidates, Ms. Le Pen, Mr. Mélenchon, or one of several mostly far-left contenders. Ms. Le Pen topped voting in both the FN's southern strongholds and a broad swathe of the French Rust Belt in the north and east, as well as in rural and semi-rural areas that have lost jobs, shops and services. Her support encircles big cities, often in villages and suburbs, as yet untouched by immigration. Ms. Le Pen lost her hold on the under-25-year-olds, who preferred Mr. Mélenchon, but remains the favourite candidate for working-class voters, capturing 37% of their support, next to 16% for Mr. Macron. This is the France des oubliés, of the forgotten, as Ms. Le Pen puts it. Campaigning under the slogan, "In the name of the people," she vows to hold a referendum on taking France out of the European Union, and thus the euro. She wants to introduce protectionist trade barriers, tax firms that hire foreigners, strengthen ties with Vladimir Putin's Russia, close the borders to immigration and strip jihadist suspects with dual citizenship of their French nationality. In many ways, Mr. Macron is her ideal opponent. She calls him a globalist, a rootless citizen, the candidate of banks and finance and the system supported by the beau monde of Paris. Early polling suggests that Mr. Macron will beat Ms. Le Pen by about 60% to 40% as voters come together to keep the FN out. Mr. Fillon and Mr. Hamon both said that they will vote for Mr. Macron to defeat Ms. Le Pen. So did Nicolas Sarkozy, a Republican ex-president. Alain Juppé, a Republican ex-prime minister, and François Hollande, the socialist president, though Mr. Mélenchon left his intentions ambiguous. Yet the polling gap is likely to narrow. This week, Ms. Le Pen stepped aside temporarily as head of the FN to try to reach out beyond her party base. Nearly a third of Mr. Fillon's voters and 9% of Mr. Mélenchon's say they will back her. On the far left, Mr. Macron is considered toxic. The choice, claim some, is between a banker and a fascist. An anti-Macron campaign in favour of abstention was circulating this week on social media under the hashtag Sans moi le 7 mai, without me on May 7th. To bridge such divides, Mr Macron needs to find a way of speaking to those who do not share his optimism about the benign nature of globalisation. His manifesto contains strong ideas on reforming lifelong learning and retraining, for example, and on shrinking class sizes in weak schools. But such promises will not bring back jobs and factories in the short run. Mr Macron also argues that technological innovation, including gig economy, firms such as Uber, can reduce ethnic discrimination in the banlieue. The most common business registered in 2015 to 2016 in such areas north of Paris was taxi driving. But many voters fear robots will put them out of a job. At a campaign stop this week in his hometown of Amiens in northern France, Mr Macron was greeted with jeering and whistling by factory workers, angry at its threatened closure. Macron is just the continuation of Hollande, said one, who said he would vote for Ms Le Pen. The election could presage a breakup of the old party system. You reap what you sow, said Manuel Valls, a socialist former prime minister who rejected his own party's candidate as too left-wing. One estimate suggests that the socialists could lose 75% of their seats at legislative elections in June. He and fellow socialist moderates have to decide whether to try to claim back the party's leadership or to campaign for En Marche. Mr Macron, who thinks he can get a majority, promises to put up candidates in each of France's 577 constituencies, half of them political novices. But this involves complex calculations. Will Mr Valls, for instance, really stand as an En Marche candidate? If not, will En Marche really field a candidate against him? On the centre-right, there is consternation too. After 5 years of socialist government, many Conservatives thought this election theirs by right. En Marche claims some are ready to defect to Mr Macron. But many still hope that they can score well at the parliamentary vote before negotiating with him. Bruno Le Maire, a Republican former Europe minister, said he would be prepared to work in a Macron government if no party secured a majority. Others are hostile. Laurent Wauquiez, a regional Republican president, ruled out backing Mr Macron, arguing that he did not want the FN to be the only opposition in France. As the two candidates enter the final lap, each can reasonably claim a part in changing the face of French politics. Ms Le Pen secured 7.7 million votes, 1.3 million more than at the first round in 2012, and a big jump from the 4.8 million her father got in 2002. When he made it into the runoff, he scored only 18%. That she might well more than double that on May 7th is a reflection of her success in turning the FN into a fixed feature of the French party system. Even if she loses, Ms Le Pen has had an outsized influence over this campaign. As for Mr Macron, he has already pulled off a historic feat. Last summer, he was a rank outsider, whose hopes of running defied all French rules about the way presidential candidacies are slow-cooked over the years. Now the man with a dream, a gamble and a heavy dose of luck appears well placed to become the youngest ever president of France's Fifth Republic. After that, the hard part begins. Award. Tom Nuttall, our Brussels correspondent, has won the 2017 Evans Prize for European Journalism, awarded for making the European project easier to understand.
Europe.
If France were America.
Marine Le Pen's second-place finish behind Emmanuel Macron has been hailed as a sign that the global wave of populist nationalism, which Donald Trump rode to victory, is receding. But if France used America's system for electing presidents, Ms Le Pen might have won. In America's Electoral College, every state gets one vote for each of its senators and members of the House of Representatives. Imagine that France's 18 regions were treated as states. Each would have 2 senators, and they would divide 157 House members according to population, with each region guaranteed at least 1. Like Hillary Clinton, the cosmopolitan Mr. Macron won the most populous urban regions, such as the one around Paris. But, like Mr. Trump, Ms. Le Pen won more of the rural regions, which an electoral college would favour. Mr. Macron and Ms. Le Pen would have ended up with 90 electoral votes each. Under the American system, if no candidate gets a majority, the House of Representatives picks the president, with each state getting 1 vote. Ms. Le Pen won 8 regions to Mr. Macron's 6, and came higher in 3 of the other 4, so she could well have triumphed. The difference between a populist tide and a centrist resurgence may come down to the electoral system.
Europe.
Religious repression in Russia. Badgering the witnesses. A pacifist sect banned by the Soviets is banned again.
When the KGB men came to his family flat, they split up Yaroslav Sivalsky and his parents into separate rooms. Mr. Sivalsky, then a young boy in the Soviet Union, watched as agents searched their belongings for banned literature. His grandparents had been exiled to Siberia for belonging to the Jehovah's Witnesses, a Christian denomination founded in America in the 19th century. His parents had kept the faith alive in their home. Now Mr. Sivalsky and the 175,000 other Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia face the prospect of returning to an underground existence. On April 20th, the Russian Supreme Court outlawed the group's activities, declaring it an extremist organization. "It's all happening again," says Mr. Sivalsky. "Back then they came after us for ideological reasons, and now because our faith is not of the right kind." The ruling puts the group, whose members preach non-violence and refuse to serve in the military, on the same legal footing as several neo-Nazi groups. Lawyers from the Russian Ministry of Justice argued that they pose a threat to public order and public security. The group's property and assets are set to be seized. Any organized religious activity will be considered illegal, with violators facing steep fines and even potential prison sentences. If implemented, the decision would be by far the most severe blow to religious freedom in Russia since the end of the Soviet Union, argues Geraldine Fagan, author of Believing in Russia, Religious Policy After Communism. The ruling is a testament to the growing influence of the Russian Orthodox Church, especially of a radical wing who see the Jehovah's Witnesses as a dangerous sect that deviates from the official version of Christianity. The court's decision marks the culmination of a long and concerted campaign. Experts trace the latest wave of troubles back to 2009, when Orthodox activists and local authorities began aggressively pursuing members and congregations. Regional courts steadily added Jehovah's Witnesses literature to lists of banned extremist works, often on absurd premises. One pamphlet was flagged for a line criticizing the Russian Orthodox Church. It was a citation from Tolstoy, whose works are not exactly banned in Russia. The group's refusal to participate in militaristic state rituals further fueled suspicion. The campaign dovetails with the drive for greater security, unity and patriotism, says Ms. Fagan. Otherness and dissent are seen as threats. The Orthodox Church's complaints found support among Russia's security services, which see the Brooklyn-headquartered Jehovah's Witnesses as a nest of pernicious foreign influence. Valery Malevany, the vice president of a security service veterans group, suggested that Jehovah's Witnesses and other Christian groups were financed by Western special services in order to carry out sabotage and intelligence work. Vitaly Milyanov, an ultra-conservative MP, said Western governments were using the group to further their goal of destroying our country through spiritual and moral decay. Roman Lunkin, of the Center for the Study of Religion and Society at the Russian Academy of Sciences, sees the crusade as part of a wave of suspicion and fear regarding the West. In recent years, Russia's courts have declared more than 140 non-governmental organizations foreign agents for receiving money from abroad. Now it has come to religion, says Mr. Lunkin. It is not clear whether the decision portends a wider crackdown or will remain an isolated incident. The Jehovah's Witnesses came under attack in part because they presented an easy target, argues Mr. Lunkin. Members do not vote, are staunchly pacifist, and enjoy little support among a population that bristles at their door-to-door proselytizing and unfamiliar theology. But the ruling is unlikely to cause believers to lose faith. Who are we supposed to listen to now, Mr. Sawalski muses? The unjust decision of the court, or God? Europe.
Millennial viniculture. The natural front. The craze for raw Pinot Noir.
At Raw Duck, a restaurant in London's trendy Hackney neighbourhood, clients crowd around communal tables under dim lights, inspecting a menu of delights such as charred purple sprouting broccoli, shaved yellow courgette and goat's curd. Along with food, the venue offers classes in pickling vegetables and making kombucha, a Japanese fermented tea. The greatest emphasis is on the wine list, all of it billed as natural or organic. But on this front, though the venue strives for eccentricity, it is part of a much larger trend. The craze for natural wine started in France in the 1990s, recalls Bertrand Celsi, a wine blogger. A small group of bacchanalians started opening offbeat organic wine bars across Paris. Now the city boasts hundreds, with many others elsewhere in France. Since the mid-2000s, they have spread across Europe and to parts of America. Raw, a London-based wine fair which started in 2012, has now opened in Berlin, Vienna and New York. This November, it will have its first show in Los Angeles. Well-heeled restaurants, such as Claridge's in London, have also started to stock the stuff, which is made not just in France, but also in Italy, Austria, Slovakia and elsewhere. Wines labelled organic must abide by European Union standards to be certified. Natural wines are even fussier. They are grown and harvested organically, but have no additives at all. Organic wine can have up to 50, such as dry yeast or tannins, sniff natural enophiles. The natural designation, however, is completely unregulated. Some natural winemakers claim that herbal tea protects their vines against diseases. Most crush their grapes with their bare feet, because that is how it was done in the good old days. Others keep wine in amphorae. A few are influenced by the biodynamic teachings of Rudolf Steiner, an Austrian who thought that astrological forces influence crops. Others simply like the taste, which ranges from cider-like juice to something resembling conventional wine, but with a trendier label and a bigger price tag. Some of this mirrors the fads for craft beer and new kinds of gin, says Jancis Robinson, a wine writer. Young people, especially hip urban types who tend to prefer gluten-free and organic food, are particularly keen. According to a survey in 2015 from Nielsen, a research firm, nearly two-thirds of those aged between 21 and 34 who drink wine several times a year said they were interested in natural wine, compared with only a minority of those over 44. The young French want to be surprised, says Sylvie Ozero, a writer and winemaker in the Loire Valley. Old people want to have the same taste every year, she sighs. An anti-establishment mood has taken root in Europe's vineyards. The rebels may be a small minority, but they are affecting the rest of the industry. Older winemakers are playing around with the natural techniques, says Ms. Robinson, blurring the boundary between establishment and upstart. As with insurgent politics, so too with plonk.
Europe.
Which alternative for Germany? Mutinies within mutinies. Germany's right-wing party abandons its bid for respectability.
History has a way of repeating itself. In 2013, a group of anti-Euro intellectuals led by Bernd Lucke, an economist, formed the right-wing Alternative for Germany, or AfD party. 2 years later, he was ousted by Frauke Petry, an erstwhile ally, who led the party to a series of sensational results in state elections by angrily opposing Angela Merkel's refugee policies. But in recent months, as the refugee crisis has moved off the headlines, the AfD's poll numbers have slumped into single digits. On April 22nd, it was Ms Petry's turn to be shunted aside at the party's conference in Cologne. Her nemesis, Alexander Gauland, a traditionalist with the grand air of a British aristocrat, who had helped her defenestrate the moderate Mr Lucke. This was more complicated than a rightward lurch. 3 groups have dominated the AfD since Mr Lucke's fall, each led by 2 main figures. The events of Cologne saw control of the party shift decisively within this sextet. One could call the first group the power seekers, Ms Petry and Markus Pretzel, her husband, and one of the AfD's members of the European Parliament. Impressed by Marine Le Pen, France's nationalist presidential candidate, they want to combine shrill politics — Ms Petry has said border guards should use arms against illegal immigrants — with a sharper, more disciplined image, a rejection of overt racism, and eventual participation in government coalitions in Germany's states. Second are the populists. Mr Gauland, for decades a doyen of the centre-right CDU, and Jörg Meuthen, a Thatcherite economist who has shared the chairmanship of the party with Ms Petry since her coup in 2015. They have been joined by Alice Weidel, a former Goldman Sachs banker, selected alongside Mr Gauland to lead the AfD's campaign for the general election in September. Few in this group really rate Ms Le Pen. Mr Meuthen told this newspaper he might even prefer Emmanuel Macron, her liberal rival. Yet in order to whip up the cheers of the AfD's grassroots, they merrily bluster about Muslims. The party's electoral programme declares Islam un-German, and evil elites. You have to move people, explained Mr Meuthen, half apologetically, after his own tub-thumping speech in Cologne. Third are the true believers. André Poggenberg and Björn Höcke, the AfD's ultra-nationalist leaders in the states of Saxony-Anhalt and Thuringia. They are backed by the party's large hardline base in the poorer, formerly communist east of Germany, and hence by the vast majority of its elected representatives. Both the power seekers and the populists find the true believers' views ugly or even racist, but they are politically indispensable. In 2015, the 3 gangs collaborated to defeat Mr Lucke, but they fractured in Cologne after months of infighting over Ms Petry's attempted expulsion of Mr Höcke. He had criticised Germany's culture of Holocaust remembrance. The populists co-opted the true believers to oust the power seekers, whose plan to detoxify the party they see as centralist and heavy-handed. Delegates threw out Ms Petry's strategy and her bid to write anti-racism into the party's charter. They cheered the populists' old tunes about feckless foreigners to the rafters. It would be easy to see this as the beginning of the end for the party, a suicidal rejection of respectability in favour of fringe zealotry. But that diagnosis may be premature. The party's poll performance is not closely linked with its actual behaviour, observes Timo Lehocky, an expert on the AfD at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. He argues that voters have priced in its excesses and dodgy characters, and that it will very probably clear the 5% hurdle needed to enter the Bundestag, Germany's lower house. Its MPs there may be inexperienced and unruly, he adds, But if Germany's centre-right and centre-left parties form another grand coalition government like the current one, yet more right-wing voters, fed up with Mrs. Merkel, may move towards the AfD. Chaotic, divided, and beyond the pale to most voters, the party may yet find a permanent, if peripheral, place in German politics. Europe.
Charlemagne. Illiberalism lives. France has comforted Europhiles, but they should worry about Poland.
It is crucial to keep Siemiaty-Chice pretty, says Piotr Szyniakowicz, the mayor, himself resplendent in bright blue suit and silk pocket square. The border with Belarus is a hop and a skip away, so this small town in eastern Poland may mark visitors' first encounter with the European Union. Siemiaty-Chice brims with well-maintained nursery schools and a gleaming sports centre, thanks to EU funds lavished on the region since Poland joined in 2004. Remittances from thousands of émigrés in Belgium have poured into handsome houses, and businesses depend on those who return for holidays. Siemiaty-Chice, beams Mr. Szyniakowicz, boasts 50 hair salons, not bad for a town of 15,000. Yet, despite all this, the nationalist conservative Law and Justice Party, or PiS party, took 38% of the vote here in 2015. A similar score nationwide won it a majority in Parliament. Since then, PiS has set about dismantling Poland's institutional checks and balances, alarming Polish liberals and startling the rest of the EU. So, amid Europe's relief at Emmanuel Macron's win in the first round of France's presidential election on April 23rd, spare a thought for places like Siemiaty-Chice. The unashamedly pro-European Mr. Macron will almost certainly defeat Marine Le Pen in their May 7th runoff. But though the threat of populist nationalism may be receding in France, further east it is a daily reality. The EU's most pressing clash with illiberalism among its members is not in Poland, but in Hungary, whose Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has been testing the club's tolerance for years. This week, the European Commission took his government to task for a law that could shut down the Central European University, a prestigious institute founded in Budapest in 1991 by George Soros, an investor and philanthropist. Hungary's grim treatment of asylum seekers, a clear violation of EU law, is also in Brussels' sights. Mr. Orbán, at least, engages with Europe. This week he sparred with the European Parliament over the higher education law. But his Polish counterpart, Jarosław Kaczyński, broods in Warsaw, rarely meeting other leaders. Mr. Kaczyński holds no public office, but as head of PiS, he micromanages the government. In March, he directed the Prime Minister, Beata Szydło, to block the reappointment of his nemesis, Donald Tusk, Poland's Prime Minister until 2014, as President of the European Council. It was a humiliating failure. All 27 other leaders, including Mr. Orbán, backed Mr. Tusk. The episode was of a piece with Poland's growing diplomatic drift. Some in Brussels want to strip Poland of its EU voting rights, the so-called nuclear option. That may never happen, but this week governments agreed for the first time to discuss Poland's trespasses. The Poles have alienated Germany and France. An alliance of interests with Britain has been rendered moot by Brexit. Even the Czech Republic and Slovakia would rather hug Germany close than join Messrs. Kaczynski and Orbán, their supposed allies in the Visegrad Group, on the naughty step. There are halting signs that the government is reining in its diplomatic excesses, perhaps because Mr. Tusk's Civil Platform party has begun troubling peace in polls. But the domestic agenda is more aggressive than ever. Mr. Kaczynski wants to subordinate judges to Parliament, weaken local government, re-Polonize local media owned by German investors, reinvent the school system, and possibly purge the diplomatic service. State agencies have lost expertise as senior civil servants are canned. Public media outlets, never a paragon of objectivity, have been reduced to propaganda organs. Peace's supporters say its critics employ double standards. Mr. Tusk was no angel, and other countries have politicians appoint judges too. But Poland is tumbling down independent global indices of political and press freedom. This presents a test for the EU's claim to be more than a glorified free trade club. Optimists say they can ride it out until voters turf peace from office at the next election in late 2019. But Mr. Kaczynski's assaults on Poland's institutions will take years for any successor to fix. Nor will there be an immediate end to the culture wars stoked by peace, which have seen opposition politicians denounced as traitors and religious fanatics picket a liberal newspaper to exorcise it of demonic influence. A recent paper for the Battery Foundation, a Polish think tank, argues that Poles' strong support for EU membership may disguise a deep well of potential scepticism about its direction. Poland's government follows God, says Elżbieta, a retiree, strolling on Siemiatycz's central square. So why is the EU fighting it? One casualty of the scrap may be those juicy European subsidies. During Mr. Szydło's attempt to unseat Mr. Tusk, François Hollande, France's outgoing president, snapped that Poland might have the principles, but the EU held the structural funds. You often hear such threats in Brussels and Berlin these days, notably over the refusal of Hungary and Poland to accept refugees. Talks on the EU's next budget begin next year. As Mr. Siniakowicz notes, the worsening of relations with the EU is bad for people here. But punishment can take quieter forms. A win by Mr. Macron will strengthen the EU's resolve and may revive the Franco-German cooperation that has often powered it. Fresh energy might be diverted to further integration of the Eurozone, which includes neither Hungary or Poland, and spread to areas such as defence and asylum. Already Brussels is siding with France in imposing rules that reduce Eastern Europeans' wage advantages when they work in the West. All this threatens to harden the divide between core and peripheral Europe and turn Poland's isolation into an ever greater handicap. Germany, and Angela Merkel in particular, will be reluctant to abandon the Poles, but Mr. Macron will have less patience, and the escapades of the illiberal Easterners could push others to his side of the debate. Poland will not leave the EU, but some in the EU are increasingly eager to leave Poland behind.
Britain.
The Economist, April 29th to May 5th, 2017. In the Britain section, the battleground in search of lost issues. Energy prices, switcheroo, budget on Bring on the Mayors, and more.
Britain.
The battleground. In search of lost issues. Theresa May and most of her opponents say the election is about Brexit. Is it really?
A general election, it is said, must be about issues. The 1964 election was about 13 wasted Tory years, and Harold Wilson's promised white heat of technology. Edward Heath's first 1974 election was over who ruled, the government or the unions. The answer was the unions, it turned out. In 1979, Margaret Thatcher promised to restore Britain's lost economic clout. 18 years on, Tony Blair touted cool Britannia and social modernity. Theresa May claims that Brexit is the main issue in her snap election on June 8th. Most opposition parties seem to agree. Although Labour's leader, Jeremy Corbyn, wants to talk about almost anything else. His Brexit spokesman, Sir Keir Starmer, declared this week that the election offered a choice of two visions of Brexit. The Liberal Democrats, under Tim Farron, hope to win 20 to 30 more seats, mainly by promising the 48% who voted Remain the chance of a second referendum. In a way, the claim that Brexit should be central is a truism, for it is bound to be the biggest task for the next government. Yet in a broader sense, the idea that this election is about Brexit must be false. Last June, voters decided by a 52 to 48% margin to leave the European Union. Pollsters find little sign that they have changed their mind, nor much demand for a second referendum. A survey by Britain Thinks, a Labour-leaning think tank, finds 67% of Britons actively favour or reluctantly accept Brexit. If not Brexit, what is the election really about? Plenty of issues are emerging, with the agenda often, perhaps surprisingly, being set by Labour, not the Tories. Labour wants to focus on the economy, inequality, austerity and public spending cuts to education and the National Health Service. This week, for instance, the party proposed large pay rises for NHS workers. One instinctive Tory response was to make security an issue, on the grounds that an anti-nuclear Mr Corbyn can never be trusted on defence. The UK Independence Party, having won the Brexit vote but not yet found a role, seems obsessed with banning the burqa and Sharia law. Mrs May ought to be vulnerable on at least some of these issues. The economy has held up well since last June, but it is starting to slow. Public services are under extreme pressure. Education cuts are biting. The social care system is fraying, and the NHS seems in dire straits, with waiting times for hospital beds and doctors' appointments rising. Yet the reply of the Tories to all such concerns is becoming wearyingly pat, that what really matters is having the strongest leader to negotiate the best Brexit deal in Brussels, protect the economy, and thereby make public services more affordable. Indeed, it sometimes seems as if Mrs May's response to any policy concern, including Brexit, has reverted to a single answer: strong leadership. That is partly because, as Tim Bale, a politics professor at Queen Mary, University of London, and historian of the Tory party, puts it, leadership has become increasingly important in political contests, particularly in this election. But it is also because the polls show that voters trust Mrs May more than any of her rivals. As well as applying to the Tories' traditionally strong areas of security and the economy, this is clearly the case with Brexit. One reason is that, although Mrs May has been tight-lipped, the Tory position on the EU is more united and less complicated than that of other parties. Mrs May is pursuing a hard Brexit that prioritises control of migration and escaping the European Court of Justice, implying departure from the single market and almost certainly the customs union. The Lib Dems say they respect the referendum result and would negotiate a soft Brexit before offering a second referendum on whether to take it or leave it. As for Labour, despite Sir Keir's promise to tear up Mrs May's plans and put more emphasis on economics, the party's version of Brexit remains obscure, not least because Mr Corbyn is ambivalent over migration. Even on the public services, long an area of relative Tory weakness, Mrs May does well with voters. Labour has historically nearly always been ahead of the Tories on the NHS, which is why the party tried once again to make it a central issue this week. But a recent YouGov poll finds that when voters are asked whom they most trust actually to run the NHS, Mrs May again outranks Mr Corbyn. In effect, Mrs May's election pitch so far is not about policies at all. She is instead asking voters whom they would rather have running Brexit talks and everything else. And she knows that on this question she beats the Labour, Lib Dem and UKIP leaders hands down. Partly for this reason, she is likely to continue to be vague, not just over her Brexit goals, but over such issues as tax, national insurance contributions, and the triple lock that supports state pensions. It seems likely that the Tory manifesto will strip away firm commitments from the 2015 version, replacing them with abstract pledges of strength and stability. If she wins a big enough majority with this approach, Mrs May will find it easier to face down both soft Remainers and hardline Brexiteers in her party. It is less clear that her negotiating position will be stronger in Brussels, where it is domestic vulnerability that often allows leaders to extract concessions from their colleagues. At home, a shortage of meaningful election promises to which she can later be held would put Mrs May in a freer position than any recent predecessor to do whatever she chooses when it comes to policy, for good or ill.
Britain.
Tactical voting. Requiem for losers. Despite the efforts of Remainers, organised tactical voting is unlikely to get very far.
In the general election of 1997, the Conservatives in Enfield Southgate, a North London seat, suffered what became known as the Portillo moment. A young, unknown Labour candidate, Stephen Twigg, overturned the 15,000 majority of Michael Portillo, a Tory cabinet minister. Tactical voting played a big part, as Liberal Democrats supported Mr Twigg, while Labour voters elsewhere backed Lib Dems. The constituency has been back in Tory hands since 2005. With a majority of 4,750, it is not a knife-edge marginal seat. The fact that its MP, David Burrows, voted to leave the EU, while nearly two-thirds of his constituents voted to remain, means it is seen by some as ripe for another upset. Remainers want to unseat pro-Brexit MPs like Mr Burrows in order to argue for a softer version of Brexit, or even its reversal. Tony Blair, a former Labour Prime Minister, said on April 24th that voters should forget party allegiances and back Remainer candidates. Will voters take his lead? Tactical voters have consistently made up around 8% of the electorate in British elections since 1992, according to Stephen Fisher of Oxford University. Several groups have recently formed with the aim of increasing that proportion. Mr Blair is part of one of the new alliances, Open Britain, the successor organisation to the Remain campaign. Gina Miller, whose Supreme Court challenge forced the government to hold a parliamentary vote on triggering Brexit, has launched Best for Britain, which has a similar goal. Another group, the Progressive Alliance, is aiming to unite left-leaning parties to topple Tories. The parties themselves are reluctant to make formal pacts, but they may pedal softly in seats where a like-minded candidate from another party is their clear front-runner. The Lib Dems will not field a candidate in Brighton Pavilion to give the Greens a clear run. The UK Independence Party will not run in some seats held by Brexiteer Tories. In Scotland, the Conservatives are courting tactical votes from those who do not want a second independence referendum, as proposed by the dominant Scottish National Party. A recent poll suggested the Scottish Tories could win as many as a dozen of the 59 seats in Scotland, where they currently have only one. In Northern Ireland, the Ulster Unionists are standing aside in 3 constituencies to help the Democratic Unionists defeat Republican challengers. The SDLP, a moderate nationalist party, is considering a pact with Sinn Féin, whose past links to violence once made it untouchable. The SDLP's leader, Colm Eastwood, says he wants a non-sectarian deal between anti-Brexit parties. None of these tactical efforts is likely to change the election's outcome. This is a Tory juggernaut, says David Cowling of King's College London. The idea that any of these alliances can change that is pure fantasy. Of the 330 seats won by the Conservatives in 2015, even a perfectly coordinated combination of Labour, Lib Dem and Green votes would have defeated the Tories in only 41 of them, he says. And with polls showing a swing of up to 9% from Labour to the Tories since 2015, some of the seats on the alliance's target lists may no longer be marginal. Mr Blair says that the question of Brexit should be foremost. It will undoubtedly sway some voters and swing a few seats. But Mr Cowling believes the former Prime Minister is just the kind of urban liberal who did not see Brexit coming and mistakenly thinks this election is a rerun of the referendum. The various alliances' proposals are a requiem for losers, Mr Cowling says. The British people have moved on. 3 middle-aged ladies out shopping in Enfield agree. Even my kids who voted Remain are voting Tory, says one. Brexit is seen as a done deal. What even is a hard Brexit? Asks her friend.
Britain.
Activists and not so activists.
As party leaders fight for the airwaves, armies of activists are pounding the ground. Whose are the most energetic? Research from the 2015 election suggests left-wingers are the loudest and proudest. Members of the leftist Scottish National Party and Greens are the most likely to share party material online. Lefties also like displaying posters, which Conservatives seem sheepish about. But when it comes to hard graft, the right-wingers come out in force. Tories are the most willing to canvass voters on their doorsteps and like delivering leaflets. Greens, true to their beliefs, don't seem to print many. Members of the right-wing UK Independence Party are big on public rallies. The differences may be down to age. The web-savvy Greens and Scottish nationalists are, on average, a good decade younger than the Tories and UKIPers, who campaign the old-fashioned way.
Britain.
Consolidation on the right. Kippers for breakfast. The UK Independence Party is toast. The Conservatives are tucking in.
With the faded grandeur of the Blackpool Tower jutting from the horizon down the street, Norman Hughes, a retired fireman, considers his options. He normally votes for the UK Independence Party, or UKIP, but doing so this time would only take a vote from the Tories, which might mess up Brexit. Instead, he says, he will support Theresa May, although he is suspicious that she may soften the government's approach to negotiating Britain's exit from the European Union. But better to risk a softer Brexit than to vote for UKIP, which might let in Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party. That would be disastrous. In 2013, when David Cameron, then Prime Minister, promised a referendum on whether to leave the EU, he did so partly to stem the flow of Tory supporters to UKIP. Although the plebiscite did not turn out as Mr Cameron hoped, his defeat may have succeeded in disarming the threat posed to his party by the populist right, at least for now. In 2013, nearly a fifth of voters said they would back UKIP. Today, the party's support is in single figures and falling. Few senior Kippers have much hope that it can be turned around quickly. For proof, look to the recent decisions taken by the party's high flyers. On March 25th, Douglas Carswell, UKIP's sole MP, left the party. On April 20th, Nigel Farage, the party's former leader, said he would not stand. As The Economist went to press, Paul Nuttall, the current leader, had yet to finish dithering about whether to contest a seat. Local organisers are flocking to the Tories, and funding is scarce. Even when on the up, UKIP struggled to concentrate its resources in particular seats as required by Britain's first-past-the-post voting system. Which competitor will benefit from UKIP's slump? Although the party's voters are a mixed bag, says Richard Hayton of the University of Leeds, the biggest group is former Tories, who are motivated to switch parties by antipathy to Europe. Now that Mrs May seeks to take Britain out of the EU, many will return to the Conservatives. UKIP has no seats to lose, but its collapse could have a big impact on the other parties' fortunes. Take Blackpool South. In 2015, Labour won the seat with 42% of the vote, 8 points ahead of the Tories. UKIP picked up 17%. This year, Peter Anthony, the Conservative candidate and a part-time hotel lounge crooner, thinks he is in with a chance. This is partly because of the weakness of Labour. I wouldn't vote for Labour with Jeremy Corbyn, says Peter Harvey, a pensioner, having a mid-morning smoke outside the George Pub and Hotel. I just don't like the bloke. But the Tories' confidence also reflects the faltering appeal of UKIP. As a Brexiteer, in a seat where 7 in 10 voted to leave, Mr Anthony believes he is well placed to gain former UKIP voters who want to keep Labour out. It's a two-horse race this time around, he says. I really do think I'll nail it. Some Labour politicians fret that, for former supporters, voting UKIP has served as a gateway drug to voting Tory, which was once seen as beyond the pale. Surveys suggest that perhaps half of those who voted for UKIP in 2015 will plump for the Conservatives this time, with very few returning to Labour. If true, that could swing more than 24 seats in the Tories' favour, mainly in the North and Midlands. UKIP's collapse could also hand the Tories a majority in Wales for the first time in more than a century. On April 24th, in a cramped conference room in a Westminster hotel, UKIP launched a euphemistically titled Integration Agenda. Measures included a ban on the burqa, annual gynecological examinations of girls considered at risk of genital mutilation, and a crackdown on Sharia courts. Peter Whittle, the party's deputy leader, argued that the biggest issues of our time are cultural. In truth, Mrs May's steadfast opposition to high levels of immigration, backing for Brexit, and support for selective grammar schools has left the party with little else. Small wonder that its voters are returning to the Tories.
Britain.
The campaigns. Speaker's Corner.
Ringing endorsement. Eject the Tories, elect a Labour government, reject austerity, privatisation and imperialist war, leave the EU single market and NATO. The Communist Party announces that it will field no candidates for the first time since 1920 in order to back Jeremy Corbyn's Labour. Morning Star. Brexit means, search me. Lord Mandelson, a Labour peer, when asked to explain his party's position on Brexit. BBC. Great expectations. The opinion polls were wrong in the 2015 general election, they were wrong in the referendum, and Jeremy Corbyn himself has said that he was a 200-to-1 outsider for the Labour leadership in 2015. And look where that got him. Theresa May plays down predictions of a landslide for her Tory party. 4 days less Labour. After 7 years of painful austerity, our workers deserve a break. Jeremy Corbyn announces that a Labour government would introduce 4 new public holidays on the days of the patron saints of England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. No sex please, we're liberals. In America, it appears that you have to invent a faith in order to be seen to be a serious candidate for anything, and in this country, maybe it appears that you have to pretend you haven't got one. Tim Farron, the Lib Dem leader and a Christian, at last says he does not consider gay sex a sin. ITV. Be the change that you wish to see. It is a bit like the Gandhi thing. First they laugh at you, then they attack you, and then you win. Paul Nuttall, leader of UKIP, which has made it to the first stage. Express and Star. Less golf, more guillotine. I would reopen public toilets. I would abolish golf courses because they are an environmental threat and a threat to the safety of people. And I want the death penalty to be reenacted. It doesn't necessarily have to be hanging. You could have the guillotine. Gisela Allen, a UKIP candidate, sets out her stall. Clydebank Post. Warming on the idea. It is a price con. He cannot control global gas prices. It is a cynical ploy. David Cameron rubbishes Labour's plan to freeze energy prices in 2013. The Tories now have a very similar policy.
Britain.
Counting migrants. 1, 2, miss a few. For a politically charged statistic, the net migration figure is surprisingly dodgy.
If insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results, British politicians' repeated promises on immigration might well be judged to be mad. In 2010, David Cameron vowed to reduce net migration, immigration minus emigration, to the tens of thousands. Theresa May, his Home Secretary and now successor as Prime Minister, has intimated that she will stick to this target in her Tory party's manifesto for the forthcoming election. So far, the promise has proved impossible to keep. Last year, net migration was 273,000, even higher than in 2010. Debate over immigration and how best to control it has become no less feverish since Britain's vote to leave the European Union. Yet given how politicised the net migration figure has become, the data behind it are surprisingly unreliable. The statistic is based on the International Passenger Survey. The IPS dates back to 1961, when the government established a travel and tourism survey to gather information about the movement of people. It was not designed to be the basis for measuring immigration, but has since become so because Britain does not ask migrants to register after their arrival. Between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m, officials at ports and airports ask travellers questions about themselves, their destination, and the purpose of their entry. Between 700,000 and 800,000 interviews are conducted a year. In 2015, foreigners made more than 36 million trips to Britain. The data for the net migration figures are extrapolated from 4,000 to 5,000 interviews of people identified as long-term international migrants. The UK Statistics Authority admits that the margins of uncertainty are wide. Britain is rare in using this kind of survey to count migrants, says Carlos Vargas Silva of the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford. In the EU, Cyprus is the only other country to do so. Countries such as America use household surveys. In 2015, Britain introduced a form of exit controls using information provided by airlines. But since it is not connected to the Home Office's data on visas, it is no help in calculating levels of immigration, points out Mr. Vargas Silva. Recently, debate has focused on whether to remove foreign students from the overall figure, something Mrs. May is apparently resisting. Those in favour argue that since overseas students stay only temporarily, are of little concern to the public, even those who want to reduce immigration substantially are relaxed about students, surveys show, and bring particularly clear economic benefits, they should be treated separately from other migrants. That is all true, but taking students out of the migration calculations might not change the net figure much. It is increasingly difficult for them to stay in Britain after their studies. The government abolished post-study work visas in 2012. There is little evidence that many stay on illegally. That suggests the inflow and outflow should roughly balance out, meaning there would be little impact on the net migration figure if they were removed from it. The IPS is particularly inaccurate when looking at subsets of migrants such as students, since the sample size is even smaller. Alternatives to the current measure, such as household surveys, would be more reliable. Determining more accurately how many foreigners arrive in and leave Britain might be a good start to deciding immigration policy, and maybe even coming up with a more sensible one.
Britain.
Energy prices. Switcheroo. The Tories poach a bad idea off Labour.
When Ed Miliband committed Labour in 2013 to freezing Britain's energy prices, David Cameron, who was Prime Minister at the time, accused him of wanting to live in a Marxist universe. Less than 4 years later, the threat to rig energy prices has resurfaced in this election. This time, the aspiring Marxist is Mr Cameron's Tory successor, Theresa May. On April 23rd, the government said that setting a price ceiling for the large majority of gas and electricity customers on the highest tariffs would be part of the Conservative manifesto, which is due out on May 8th. It insisted that such a cap was different from Mr Miliband's freeze because it would be administered by the regulator Ofgem and would be flexible. Analysts, however, said that in practice there would be little difference. Both approaches risk a return to heavy-handed regulation of the energy market reminiscent of the 1970s. The fact that the two biggest parties now see eye to eye on the need for intervention in energy markets partly reflects an unpopular surge in domestic electricity bills this year. But it also suggests the market is deeply flawed. In most industries, from airlines to coffee shops, customers are rewarded for loyalty. Yet in the energy industry, the most sticky clients are penalised, with tariffs substantially higher than those offered to new customers. Last year, the Competition and Markets Authority, or CMA, Britain's antitrust agency, concluded that 70% of customers of the Big Six energy suppliers, Centrica, SSE, Scottish Power, npower, E.ON and EDF, had failed to switch from the highest standard variable tariffs, or SVTs. On average, in 2011 to 2015, they paid 11% more for their electricity than those on other tariffs. By milking those inactive customers, who are mostly poor, undereducated and elderly, the suppliers boosted their profitability. The CMA found no collusion among the Big Six, but their business model encourages them, as one Tory MP puts it, to treat their longest-serving customers as chumps. This exacerbates distrust of the industry. For all its concerns, the CMA refrained from ordering a price cap for people on SVTs except the poorest, who are on prepayment meters. It said rigging prices risked stifling competition from firms challenging the Big Six with cheaper fixed-rate tariffs, as well as reducing people's incentives to switch. Mrs May's price cap would ignore those conclusions. It would put politicians back at centre stage in energy markets, making policy more unpredictable. There are more nuanced ways of lowering default tariffs while preserving competition, and more effective ways to nudge people onto new tariffs. One of the CMA's main recommendations, that companies should have access to information on customers stuck on an SVT for more than 3 years so that they can offer them better deals, may work. The key is to preserve choice. Encouraging people to look after their own best interests is surprisingly complex, but having politicians do it for them is not the answer.